Me? No.
You should call him so you can talk to him. Okay.
So Paul, do you think, just so I know for switching purposes, are you gonna like try to zoom in on whoever's talking and out and like?
Cause I'm just gonna play that by ear.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean,
You
it's
can.
gonna look a lot better,
Yeah.
you know. And I could, it kind of depends on the PowerPoints. Can they control the PowerPoints from up there, or do they have someone? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. That's the only thing I hate about the panels and PowerPoints. Run the PowerPoint, you just turn around, look at the PowerPoint. I've had this happen. When I'll talk to like, try not to, like, I'll do it used to, kind of get used to that. So. And people try to listen to it. That's a plus.
Make us progress.
Yeah, a year and a half later, we're making a little progress. It's starting to be the same people now, so they listen.
Can you tell if they're? Can you even tell?
What's that?
Can you tell if anybody logs on?
If they go to the chat thing and say, hey, I'm on, yeah.
Got it.
They're using Chrome. Yeah. It has it like watching now.
Yeah.
Oh, he does?
Yeah, there was a watching now number that pop up. There's
What?
nobody watching it yet.
Well, I'm gonna call him, see if I can get him. Hi, Stan, this is Judy from the Columbus Bar Association. How are you? I'm good. Are you logged in? Can you see me?
We just switched to, hang on. I got two on. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can you see me yet? I'm sitting there on the phone with you. It still says just ESOP Institute on the title screen. Thank you for answering the phone, by the way, when I called you from my random cell phone number.
Tell them that they need to press play on their viewer.
Press play on your viewer. Can ya? Can you hear me? Good. There's a little, yeah.
There'll be a delay.
He can see me and he can hear me. We are, that's so awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so I think we're good to go, and you got my instructions about how to fill in your card, your CLA card. I'll take care of you. You are so awesome. You are on it. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you doing this for us. Oh my gosh, no worries. We love the Ulmer office down here. I can see your Columbus office from my office. And so what I'd love to be able to do in the future, if you guys have anything that you want to see relative to CLE, if you want to put on a CLE here, you can be a landing site for us as well. So let me know. Yeah, we've had a couple people from your office do CLEs for us, and they've done such a good job. All right, kiddo. Well, I appreciate you, and thank you. Have a great rest of the day, Stan. I will. See you later. Okay. Mm-hmm. Bye. He's happy.
It's not gonna change though, is it? It's not I swear my feet have been crossed so many times.
It can't change unless you touch it.
It won't like change on its own?
No.
All right, just making sure. I mean, I know.
Maybe I did it when I sat down there.
I'll just keep it. Stress me out.
Judy.
All right, if I can have everybody's attention, please. Thank you. First and foremost, before we get started, I want to welcome our partners in Cleveland. The law firm of Ulmer and Byrne are joining us today via live webcast, and we thank them and welcome them. Second, welcome to all of you. This is the ESOP Institute, so if you are here expecting something else, you may now leave. That said, this is what we hope to be a continuing series, right, Sherry? Of learning opportunities on this particular subject. For purposes of your continuing education credits, we are going to grant today two kinds of credit, CLE, traditional continuing legal education credit, which is accessible by filling out the yellow card that each of you should have, and continuing education credit for CPAs, which will be granted via a uniform certificate of attendance, which you can collect after the program. If you did not ask for a UCA when you walked in, check with us at the break, and we'll make sure that we have it ready for you to pick up on your way out, okay? Second, for purposes of CE, you will be responsible for submitting to the various appropriate boards your UCA. For purposes of CLE, we will report within 30 days from today. Check your transcripts early and often if this is your reporting year. Because this is a live broadcast, we're going to ask you to turn off anything that would make noise, including a watch, a phone, any ticking or talking devices, please. If you need to make a phone call, please excuse yourself. And if you leave the room and are out of the room for more than 15 minutes, unfortunately, we're going to have to make note of that as you check out. I will give you the activity code at the conclusion of this program. One last thing. Immediately after the program, there is a cocktail reception that has been sponsored by Lazier Capital Partners, and we thank you for doing that. We urge you to stay. We have refreshments, open bar, and amazing food, and great networking opportunities. If you're ready, I'm going to turn the program over to Sherry Lazier. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you, Judy. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ESOP Institute. My name is Sherry Lazier, and I'm the General Counsel of Lazier Capital Partners. I have with me here today my colleagues, starting over here, Ted Lape, Bruce Lazier in the middle, and Mike Borowski on the end. This institute is jointly presented by the Columbus Bar Association and Lazier Capital Partners. Today, we're going to be discussing the fundamentals of ESOP transactions by using a hypothetical consulting firm called Acme Services. Then we are going to have a panel discussion which examines the ESOP transaction from the perspective of the various participants, including the lenders, lawyers, the valuation firm, and the trustee. So at this point, I will turn it over to my colleagues, and we will begin.
Hello, I'm Bruce Lazier, and today we're going to do an overview as a teaching method about ESOPs that's going to use a hypothetical deal and show how you look at this as an ESOP formation opportunity and how you would put together a transaction. The goal of this is to stimulate questions from the crowd. This is a dialogue. If somebody has a question, raise your hand at any time. This is really very much of a presentation deck we do with prospective clients to show them what an ESOP is, who the parties are, how it works financially, and all of the other items. Is the sound better now? So, with no further ado, I'm going to start taking you through this. By way of background, I'm also an attorney. I haven't practiced in over 20 years, but I was a M&A lawyer in my first life with kind of a tax emphasis. And as you'll learn as we go through ESOPs, they're very tax-motivated transactions in black letter law in the code. And you know, if you have questions from a perspective relative to lawyer stuff, I can probably help you with those too. So, with no further ado, I'll start with just a little bit about us. The firm was founded in 1999, and we're truly the only investment banking firm in Columbus, Ohio. And that means we're financial advisors to mergers and acquisition transactions. We aren't the lawyers. You guys have a completely different role. I understand the role, but it's a very different role. Ours is about what's the financial value of the company and how do you get to the value. Certainly, we're middle market companies. You're sitting in Columbus. You aren't doing Goldman Sachs deals. These are privately held enterprises owned by people, generally who have spent their entire adult lives building them. And those are our typical clients. And we have a lot of diversity in our firm in terms of backgrounds. I mean, I have a legal background, a tax background. My partner Mike here is a former international firm CPA and really operationally capable guy. And Ted is had a deep experience in banking that included lending to the ESOP community on a national basis. So we all come from little different places. Our firm does a lot of things. ESOP advisory is a big piece of our practice, but we help management buyouts. We help people sell their businesses. Major part, we raise capital. And we also have a turnaround. We also do turnaround transactions. Distress M&A has always been a background, including investing our own capital in transactions, which is known as merchant banking. So now I'm going to kind of give you a quick overview. But
I just wanted to second something Bruce said earlier about asking questions throughout the presentation. It'll make it much more interesting and informative. Chances are we're not getting everything out here that you're wondering, so don't hesitate to raise your hand. And the other issue I'd like to raise real quick is that Bruce mentioned we're an investment banking firm, which means we look for the end solution for our clients, whatever it may be. Although this presentation is tailored to ESOPs, that might not always be the best solution. So we're trying to figure out what that is up front. And in the next slide, I think Bruce is going to speak to a variety of different engagements.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, we're agnostic. This is an important element. We are not a hammer looking for a nail. An ESOP is not the answer for everybody. It's an answer that works in particular circumstances extraordinarily well. But we are an investment banking firm. It's mergers and acquisitions, and our sell-side experience, we've done more deals over our history that are not ESOP than ESOP, even though today we're doing a lot more ESOPs than non-ESOPs. And we're indifferent as long as it's maximizing the value for the client, which is why we're all here. So looking to the next page, we have some representative transactions, and I'll just mention a few of them. Best Restaurant is a company that was owned by 3 partners. They came to see us. There was a roll-up player in their industry who was going to offer them over 7 times EBITDA earnings, cash flow. And when they heard the ESOP pitch as well as the pitch to how we go to market, they looked at us and said, well, we'll do the ESOP. And I said, but it's not more money. It's a little bit less. And they said, yeah, but we hate the roll-up guy, and this is better for our people. You'd be surprised how many wealthy people who build businesses think that way. I know I was initially, so that's kind of an interesting one. Lion Video up here, and our client Bob Lyon's spoken before, so I'm not out of school and giving you some idea of some numbers because he's given them. He had a C corporation that rented equipment. And I don't think that's probably best tax structure because you don't get a flow through. And if you sell the assets, you're going to have ordinary income inside the C corporation, then dividend it up. You have 2 levels of tax. When we met Bob, he had basically no basis, and his equipment, those giant trucks at the Ohio State football game for the TV, that's what he does all over the country. And those trucks cost $8 to $12 million. And because of bonus depreciation during the Great Recession, he had no depreciation left. In fact, because he'd accelerated his depreciation so much, he was now going to be extremely high taxation inside that C Corp. So much so that his actual next lease payments that coming forward within 6 months, his payments on the leases for those lessors was so great that he wouldn't have the money to pay his taxes. I mean, this was looking at an insolvency opportunity because of tax obligations that had been deferred. And in that circumstance, using the ESOP in ways we're going to show you, where he could avoid ever paying the tax, that tax inside the C Corp by selling stock instead of assets, and we did a strategic search. People only wanted to buy assets. By selling stock, he got rid of the tax entirely inside the company, and by using Section 1042, which is a tax-free rollover of proceeds from an ESOP, similar to 1031 like-kind exchange for real estate, that people are generally more familiar with, he was able to literally more than double his net after tax. It went about 250%. Wild outcome, and really was an eye-opener for me. Next one I'll mention is Border Energy, a strategic transaction. Two partners had a great business, $100 million in sales, lots of profit. Strategic, we did a full sales process, got people bidding across the country, had an excellent transaction. And I'll mention the last one on this sheet is Decker, stay in that same line. We regularly, and it's been a practice area of Sherry Lazier's as well as mine for over 30 years, is what I call corporate divorce. It's where you have partners who actually can't work with each other anymore, and somebody needs to buy somebody out, and litigation is either present or threatened. And the ability to use financial thinking and our ability to create leverage, and Sherry Lazier is now leading our litigation solutions group, which is about helping lawyers help their clients to settlement of complex business litigation or threatened litigation that takes a financial acumen to really put it together, that isn't just about an expert opinion saying, oh, it's worth X, but really about how to get to a solution. Next page begins our demo. Enough on us. We came up with a hypothetical deal that we hope is factually easy to follow, and I'll go through it. The owners of the company are two 60-year-old founders who want to consider their options to obtain liquidity. They're open to lots of options. It's a consulting firm, and its most valuable asset are its people. So it's a people-intensive business. Not that every ESOP has to be, but it can be. The retention of the team is essential to the sales transaction because you need these people to be successful. And Acme has EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, which is a proxy just for cash flow, of $2 million, and they expect an 8% growth rate over the next 5 years. That's their number, not ours. And it's an LLC taxed as a partnership. So they file a 1065 for tax. And they've held their membership interests for over 3 years, which is relevant. And for purposes of just making it a little more complicated, they have $500,000 of cash on their balance sheet and $1.5 million in debt. Typically, companies sell cash-free, debt-free, so I'm throwing cash and debt in so you can see what the impacts are. So basically what we have is a consultancy. And it's a consultancy that the people really matter, and it makes good money. We've got some guys who are thinking about how to get to their capital. That's your overview. Any questions on our facts before we start, because it's going to matter?
Bruce, I have a question for you. Talk to us about the age of the founders and how that plays into their different choices here.
Absolutely. I've been doing M&A for over 30 years, and when people ask me the most relevant factor in knowing if there's going to be a transaction, it's always one factor, their age. 40-year-olds don't sell their companies. 60-year-olds do. When people get to their mid-50s, they start thinking about selling. And if they don't sell by the time they're in their mid to late 60s, sometimes they just want to work for the rest of their lives, and there's nothing wrong with it. But the natural period to be thinking about liquidity is mid-50s to early mid-60s. That's when it is, and that's why I made them this age. And you'll see with the ESOP, typically these people stick around for a few years. So if the guy was 70 when he's doing it, it looks different than a guy who's 60.
Bruce, could you tell our group what type of consulting firms are you seeing that like to participate in ESOP transactions?
Consultants of all ilk, IT consulting firms has been a huge niche, but engineering firms, firms that are engaged where you sell your time, not lawyers and not accountants typically, But engineering and architectural firms are huge ESOP swaths across the country, and consultancies of all kind. IT, we had a number of IT consulting firms on that first page. I just didn't get into it. So let's look at what the seller's objectives are. They're really pretty simple. Everyone wants to maximize their after-tax cash at close. An ESOP's going to enable the company to be tax-free for federal and state of Ohio purposes for the rest of time at closing. So we make that a pretty good thing, because not paying tax means you almost double your cash flow available for debt service and to repay people. It's an enormous hit. We'll talk about it later. And then to use that increased cash flow to pay themselves back, because when they sell in an ESOP, it's not an all-cash deal. You get some money from the bank. The remainder is on a promissory note payable by the company to you as seller. And doubling cash flow means you can get paid quicker. Corporate governance always is an issue. People sometimes errantly think you work for the trustee and they can smoke a cigar, put their feet on the table, and tell you what to do. That's not accurate. I'll get into that. And they want to maintain operational control, which the ESOP allows. And the legacy of the company is oftentimes as driving as anything, taking care of the people who made them rich, and then the legacy of the company. And then for management and employees, it creates a really valuable incentive for key employees, because as Ted will explain later, we can give them free extra shares, essentially, in value. And you get large retirements for people that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And for attracting and retaining people, they're getting more here than their next best job at the same salary. And people feel job security is great because you're not selling to a roll-up company who may get rid of a bunch of people, which is not uncommon. The next slide goes to operational control.
Yeah.
Okay. Operational control, and I'm not going to go super deep, but the real important piece is the nomination committee, and this is a standard set. People say to me, how do you have control? That doesn't sound right. The trustee owns all the shares. And the way it works is the nomination committee in the corner there actually goes to the trustee with a slate of board members. And the trustee is known as a directed trustee, meaning they're required to actually vote in favor of that slate of board members as long as they're not violating their fiduciary duties to the employees, which I'm talking about really bad stuff like fraud. If you think these are good people, you vote for them. Then the board elects the CEO, and the CEO picks the leaders, and that keeps the employees. So what really happens is by controlling the nominating committee, you control the board, and by controlling the board, you control everything in operations. The trustee is a fiduciary for the employees, but they are not an operating member of the company or the board, and they typically come to one board meeting a year and typically like quarterly financials, just so they know they're exercising their fiduciary duty. Any questions on that page at all? Okay.
One other point I'd like to make too, though, is that the key employees are generally signed to a long-term employment agreement. So they know for a period of generally 3 to 5 years, they're employed by the company as the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and that gives them a great deal of comfort as well. And I'm not sure about the term on the board of directors. I think it's a little bit less, 1 to 3 years maybe.
Yeah, I didn't mention the term. Yeah, the board terms, and the way it works is the directed trustee gets a slate, because the nominating committee does it that way. So they can't say thumbs up, thumbs down. I love Mike, but Bruce, well, they might say that, but they can't do that. The trustee has to either accept or reject the board. And another important point about the trustee is they can be terminated with or without cause at any time with 30-day notice in their engagement agreements. They are there, and I'll talk more about trustees in a moment. They are there as a legal shield for our clients and your clients when they do an ESOP transaction. It's a third-party fiduciary doing their job, which means that the transaction's cleaner and not likely to be attacked. So when we start looking at the trustee and their role is to protect our clients from anyone ever second-guessing the transaction, and that's really the goal of the trustee relationship. I'm going to go through a slide that, as a guy who's been doing M&A for 30 years, and when I first started doing ESOPs, I had to convince myself everything in this slide is true. And being a lawyer who's a little skeptical by training, it took me a while to believe it, but I actually believe that this is exactly accurate. So let me go through the runs. We got the objective on the left, the do nothing, which means just keep the company and do what you've been doing. You're doing fine. Sale to a third party as a limited liability company is the third column. And the fourth column is sale to an ESOP with what's known as an LLC to C to S. Let me stop for a moment and explain what that is, even though it's a little bit disjointed. Any entity that's a C Corp, on the date they sell, if they sell their shares directly to an ESOP trustee, can defer their gain similar to a like-kind exchange. How many people here know what a like-kind exchange is? Does anyone not know that term? Okay? Because a like-kind exchange for real estate is, I sell this building, there's a big gain, but if I buy another building of the same value, I can defer the gain till I sell that building. ESOPs have the same thing, provided you buy US stocks and bonds or actively managed real estate that you personally run. So the LLC that he has today is not a C Corp. How could he ever get 1042? And the answer is, not over-taxy, but you do what's known as a Section 351, Internal Revenue Code 351 transaction, where you take the LLC units and you contribute them uphill tax-free to a new C Corp. Now you have a C Corp. You sell the C Corp shares, and then you elect to become an S Corp. And we'll talk about that S Corp election in a moment, but that's how you're tax-free. 100% S Corp ESOPs are tax-free for federal and state income tax purposes. And that is the big unlock of value here, along with the 1042. So just a little bit, because I'm going to compare it on the right, and later we'll get more into the tax. So, objective, taxation on gain. Well, if you don't do anything, you take the risk of tax rates change. Sale to a third party, well, the all-in gains rates, ignoring for a moment basis, because your LLC has a capital count, it's about 25%. And we'll do the math later and prove it to you, but it's real close. But if you're a C Corp on the date you sell, there is no taxation on your gain. It is deferred until you sell what you bought with it. And there are ways to defer that forever, okay? Maximizing value. Well, if you do nothing, you take the risk of things getting better or things getting worse. If you sell to a third party, you get fair market value, and it's determined by the market. So if you do what we typically do, which is a sale process, we get the best possible buyers, and we have them bid against each other. That's how you find out what it's worth. If you do a sale to an ESOP, you don't have a bunch of buyers, you have one, and that's really the trustee. And they hire a valuation firm. We'll go through everyone is a little bit later in more detail, but they will go through it, and the trustee's valuation firm will set the maximum value. They'll set the range of values and maximum value. Okay? Liquidity and payout. And we're talking about a consultancy here. If you keep it, you get shareholder distributions, just like you do now. If you sell it, and let me talk about consultancies in particular. When I left the practice of law, I actually rolled up advertising agencies all over the United States with a high school buddy. That's what I did. And while I was doing it, I came to learn there was a valuation metric for advertising agencies, which is like every other consultancy. You're selling 5 times EBITDA, with about half up front, the remainder over 3 to 5 years, but contingent consideration. So in my facts, I have a consultancy. Realistically, they get 40 to 60% in cash, the remainder contingent over 3 to 5 years. And here's something that's important about a contingency, a couple things. One is, when you sell on an earnout, and I've done many dozens of earnout deals, the seller never retains control. And the analogy I use is, I got this shiny great car I'm driving, making money. That's my company. But when I flip somebody else the keys and they run it off the road, it's my problem, because I took a contingent purchase price and the company didn't perform. The other point I would make is, the lack of control married with contingency is especially a scary thing, because you don't have the ability to control things, and that might deprive your earnout. So in my facts here, we have a consultancy, so it's upfront plus potentially contingent, almost certainly so. And in the ESOP, you get an upfront, maybe even less than the upfront you get with a sale to a third party, but it is a fixed obligation to pay. It is a promissory note. Future performance may determine when you get your cash, but it's not contingent, it's fixed. Huge unlock between ESOPs and traditional earn-out deals is fixed versus contingent. And fixed has an interest rate because it's a promissory note. Contingent, I don't even know how earn-out deals, I've never seen interest rate in an earn-out. Why? Because it's not a fixed obligation to pay. How could you pay interest on it? So big unlock there. Likelihood of close. Well, sale to a third party in any auction process is completely unknown. I've done many an auction at high values where there's really only one buyer left. And if they knew that everyone else had left, but they can't see it, they don't know because we don't tell them, it would be really ugly in terms of value, but it would also be, what if they walk? You're dead. In an ESOP, it really gets down to, does the owner or the ownership group change their mind? If they want to do it, this is closing, because the trustee will get fair value. They're not going to overpay for it, and they shouldn't. But there's not somebody to blow up the deal. I was in a deal once where a company had a bad quarterly earnings, and on the buy side, and they walk away from the deal, and you're like, but. Well, there's no, here, it's up to the company. Disruptions to operations. I think anyone who's done any M&A will know that, the consultants from Deloitte will parachute in and live there as long as they can, and it's very disruptive to operations because many employees are fearful for their jobs if there's an acquisition. In an ESOP, it's not that way at all. We load a data room with tons of information. They ask hundreds of questions, but it doesn't impact the employees because they just don't see it happening. Most of our clients, the employees don't even know an ESOP's been formed until after the transaction closed. I had one guy who went to Sicily for 3 weeks and drank grappa and sat in the sun, and then came back and told his employees they owned the company. So it's a different kind of environment. So due diligence process. With multiple buyers, it's a really intense process. We've all been there. But with an ESOP, again, it's one buyer, and it's streamlined, and it usually runs through us as the investment banker. Escrow reps and warranties. Anyone who here has ever negotiated an M&A deal knows how painful this can be. It's not unusual to spend 4 to 6 weeks in a transaction negotiating the basket, tipping or non-tipping, survival for indemnity purposes, cap on indemnity, all the carve-outs. And as crazy as it sounds in ESOP setting, because it's collegial and it's not somebody in another law firm trying to see if they can steal from your client, which is how I feel about it. Here, everyone's trying to be fair. The people in the transaction think their job is to run to the 50-yard line, not to make you go to your own end zone and battle your way out. So it's not unusual to negotiate all these important terms I just mentioned in under an hour. I mean, in under an hour, all of them. It's completely different. My blood pressure got much lower. Employee impact. Well, you don't know when you sell to a third party. It might be great for them, it could be bad, or it could be great for some and real bad for others. Mid-level managers, senior guys, they're generally the guys that you worry about. In an ESOP, it's only positive. When I'm done with this, hopefully you'll agree they've been given the company, literally given the company, the employees. That's how this works. But the current owners who are selling get all the earnings till they're paid their purchase price. Then the employees own it. Nobody writes a check, no one pledges their home, no one goes and takes money out of their 401k plan, and nobody guarantees debt. Post-closing involvement, it's the buyer's call. Sale to an ESOP.
Risk versus the reward. Risk can be great, and the reward can be great as well. The risk can include, the time you're spending on it, the cost. You have so many different professionals you're paying for, and as Bruce said, the certainty to closing is not always very high. In fact, we had a client who ended up forming an ESOP firm in the recent past who did want to sell to a third party. They went out and they hired an investment banker, and a very good one at that. And the investment banker drafted an excellent memorandum, did all the right things. They went out and they canvassed the entire market. They looked for competitors. They looked for financial buyers. And lo and behold, they had 50 different buyers interested in this company. I mean, that is as good as it gets. And then from there, they chose the top 10 to continue the conversations with. And at that point, they had to give additional financial disclosure about, who their customers are, what their margins are, their key employees, how their business really works. They invited these 10 different parties into their business for tours. And unfortunately, the transaction didn't happen because they didn't get what they considered to be an adequate offer from any of those 10 buyers. So they went through this entire process. It took a year. It cost, multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars only for them to be disappointed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that word got out in their industry that they were for sale. Their customers found out about this, and they lost business as a result. And, I'm not saying this always happens, but it is a real tangible risk. And if you really sit down with a business owner and say, hey, should we sell this to a third party? And they're really thinking about this the right way, they get scared at everything I just said. And they're worried about it. And like Bruce said, the ESOP isn't always the best alternative, but it's an alternative that mitigates a lot of those risks. Okay? It might not have as much of an upside as selling to a strategic competitor that can eliminate a lot of costs, but you don't have a lot of the downsides from the process either.
Yeah, and I just one quick comment. I know you're always looking for opportunities for your clients. If you have a C Corp client, as Bruce mentioned, there's double taxation. So usually when you look at that, they're paying about 50% in taxes because everyone wants to do an asset sale with double taxation. It's huge. This is a way to pay 0%. So if you have any C Corps where you're thinking, gee, how can they sell? This is a great way, rather than flipping to an S Corp and waiting for the building gains tax to kind of burn off. The second thing is, if they have a lot of depreciated assets and they sell, normally they've depreciated below what they're worth. So you have to recapture that depreciation when you sell, and you have a lot of ordinary income. This avoids that, even if they don't do that tax-free sale. So it's a way for companies with lots of depreciated assets or a C Corp to really do well in a sale, even though most of our clients aren't either one of those. That is a special situation where it can be really good.
My next slide starts talking about, and this slide really just brings up,
There's a question there, Bruce.
Oh, I'm sorry, please.
All these examples, are we talking only about 100% sale, or are we talking about some portion of
You can do an ESOP at 100% or not 100%, but here's the rub. If you have a company that does a 60% ESOP, 40% non-ESOP, you still have 40% of the company taxable. So let's say you make $2 million a year, you still have $800,000 of taxable income, assuming that $2 million is taxable income. You still got $800,000 taxable income, and the company, when you're 100% ESOP, there's no hole in the bucket where money comes out to the government. Now suddenly, 45% of 800,000, let's call it 375. $375,000 is going to get lost to the company that otherwise wouldn't be, and that's a material amount of money. It just is. So what happens is that's a disincentive. The other thing is when you go to sell the other 40%, it's a minority interest. It's not control shares and may be subject to taking a discount and a lower price per share in value than today. If it's worth, $10 a share for control, what's lack of control? Is it $8, $8.50? And finally, when you put debt on a company, you reduce the value of equity. So let's just say a company that's going to sell at 5 times EBITDA, $2 million, $10 million company, you sell 60%. Take $6 million of debt on to pay back the bank, as we'll show you later, plus the sellers. The equity's left at $4 million. The 40% shareholder doesn't have $4 million equity. They have 40% of $4 million in equity, which is $1.6 million. So there's a bunch of reasons, and that might be a little complex for today. There are a lot of reasons why many, many, many people crowd towards a 100% transaction, but you don't have to. Was that helpful at all? Good.
There's one other thing. The seller note typically has a really big return, and if you don't sell 100%, you get a lot less return because the seller note's smaller.
So the ESOP alternative in the next slide. Probably everyone here knows that this is part of ERISA. It's in the Internal Revenue Code, and nothing we're going to talk about today is a loophole or case law or made up. It's right out of ERISA. And the thing that's different about this conversation than people how they thought of ESOPs in the past, many companies have small ESOPs. 5% of the company is like a stock plan. It's a benefit plan. This is using them differently. This is using them as a transition tool for ownership. And that's what the number one up there is. So this is about you're selling your business this way rather than giving your employees a little corner of the company this way to get them to feel an ownership mentality. Not that that's bad, but this is a different thought. An ESOP is an employee retirement plan, as everyone I'm sure here knows. It's qualified. There's non-discrimination rules. They have tax deferred growth within them, which is cool. The trustee, as we said, is a planned fiduciary. And the way that I, as an employee in ESOP, benefit is when I retire or died or disabled or just leave, there's value in my shares that eventually the company has to buy me out of. So I'm getting value, and it's based on the value of those employer shares that are in my account. Okay? And from a tax efficiency, there's not a more efficient thing in the code than an ESOP. Because where else can you show me something that's tax-free forever for an operating business? I mean, heck, if a charity has a business making money, they call it UBTI, unrelated business taxable income, and they tax it. It's like my 401k grows tax-free, so does this. It's something I just don't think you can find elsewhere. The deferral of the gain is available if you're C Corp on the date of the transaction. We're talking about 1042 more. And the tax-free status is available provided, you're an S Corp, because that means the flow-through is to an ERISA plan. And as we already established, 401k plans, they grow tax-free. So this is kind of a broad overview. And from here, we're going to dive into who everyone around the table is. Because we've used the term trustee and valuation from the purpose of this slide is who are we talking about? And in our panel discussion, you'll meet some of these people who we're talking about, who we work with on a regular basis. So who are the parties? More or less, the left side is the sellers and the right side is the buyers, and we're kind of in the middle. So who is everyone? The selling shareholders, and we really represent the selling shareholders. Our job as investment bankers is to get what we call a full and fair value for the benefit of the sellers that's also a fair deal for the buyers, which is the employees ultimately. We spend a lot of time structuring and looking at options for them because at the end of the day, the seller only sells once. Usually it's their entire adult lives building this business. They want to know this makes sense. They got to understand it, and it's complicated. The key employees in most every business, whether consultancy or not, the key employees drive a lot of value, and they're the successorship as management. So how do we tie those people in? And Ted will talk to that later. How do we tie these people in so that the success of the company in their own is so inexorably intertwined that it works perfectly for everyone? Company counsel. We consider ourselves the quarterback of the transaction, but the quarterback of the lawyers is company counsel. And company counsel's role is really to lead the transaction and putting together the plan documents, the purchase agreements, and all the other agreements. The trustee has the buy team. This is on the sell side again. The accounting firm, they're professional advisors to our clients, are key members of all this, because the accounting firm needs to really understand the tax issues. And although I think we involve ourselves deeply in the tax planning, we have people who've been preparing their returns for years and understand with depth some of the tax issues they face. We work and interface with their accounting firm both for their tax elements as well as for projecting their earnings, because we need earnings projections for the next 5 years to undertake a formation. And oftentimes the company lacks the skill to be able to think quite that deeply, and their accounting firm plays a key role. And then finally, the third-party administrator, and I can see we got some folks here. Pete Schuler is here. And the TPAs are the guys who keep track of all the rules that affect each participant's account balance and how my account balance works and what the issues are. It helps the company monitor many different types of requirements set forth in an ESOP. and they are an indispensable tool post-closing in every transaction we do. So let's look on the right side. This is the buyers. Well, the trustee. The trustee is the most important person on that side, and that trustee is, the Department of Labor, and really the oversight for ESOPs is the IRS for tax, and the Department of Labor for fairness to employees. And there are a bunch of rules. They're called the Department of Labor Fiduciary Process Agreement. And we basically follow those rules to a T. And they say everyone looking at this should interview at least 3 trustees and then pick whoever they want. So part of our role is to bring in for interview trustees with a depth of experience in ESOPs who understand how the process works and understand it completely. And they're professional firms who they engage in the business of being trustees, including with a concentration of trustees for ESOPs. It's actually a specialized niche. They will hire their group of professionals. The most important one from our client's perspective is typically the valuation firm. Now, the valuation firm is the one who's going to determine the value of the seller. Now, it's not black and white, like you give them something, they go look at the financials, they go, it's worth X. Rather, one of our biggest roles is to understand our clients deeply, and to make what we call the argument for value, which is, why is this company great? Every company has things that make it great and things that make it less great. Probably most of you have heard of a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. SWOT analysis is 101 strategic planning stuff. We build a book to sell the company, just like if we're selling to a third party, that talks about the company's strengths, their weaknesses, their opportunities, their threats, so that the trustee can have a full understanding in the valuation firm what's really here, and why does the company have value, and when there are weaknesses or threats. We talk about what the company's doing to mitigate those threats. Those mitigation steps have a lot to do with the valuation of the company, and the projected earnings have a lot to do with the valuation of the company, and the depth of the company, and their customers. And we'll talk about things like concentration of revenue. There's a million things that matter, but we want that valuation firm to understand this. The trustee council, they have their own independent lawyer. These are lawyers who've done these, and they're very, very knowledgeable. And then we always source capital for our clients so that they can bring money in to pay the cash portion at closing, which will be talked about later. And then the lenders have their own counsel. And our job in the middle is to optimize the results, to really look at an assortment of options, which includes a depth of tax discussion and analysis, to make that argument for value. And we negotiate the transaction for the benefit of the seller. We're an investment banker. We got a seller. We're negotiating transaction terms. These are expensive transactions. They're not for companies that make 200 in EBITDA. There's just too much going on, too many professionals. Look at the sheet of paper so you can see that. And we manage the transaction process throughout. With no more on my thing, I'm going to turn over to, does anyone have any questions on that page before I turn it over for the next piece? The parties to the transaction really, really matter. And one last thing is, there's something we call it the ESOP community, and those of you from the community who are going to speak today are here. It's really not very big. Nationwide, it's not that big. And it's a group of people who work in a collegial way together to make fair deals. And it's unlike dealing with, I've had the experience of dealing with New York counsel backed by a hedge fund. It's night and day difference. And it lends itself to good, fair transactions. The next portion of this is going to be valuation. My partner, Mike Morosky, will take over from here.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. So before we go any further, though, to underscore what Bruce said, part of our responsibility is to organize all these eight different constituents on the side of the transaction, each side, to get the transaction in on budget and on time. If you don't have someone pushing and facilitating and creating information and making sure everyone's communicating, the deal could go sideways quick, it could lose momentum, or it could take 6 months, 8 months, whatever, whereas our typical transaction lasts 3 to 4 months, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So the valuation, let's talk about that. This is very important. It's the key component when understanding the economics of the transaction. Of course, any business owner wants to know, what's my business worth? How much am I going to be able to sell it for? And they have a lot of trepidation about selecting any path, whether it's selling to a third party or forming an ESOP, until they have a better understanding. And when they sit in our office for that first meeting and we talk about selling it to a third party, as Bruce said earlier, the best we can say is, hey, we'll run a full and fair marketing process, and your business will be worth what a willing buyer tells you they'd pay for it. With the ESOP, it's a little bit different because you have a valuation firm involved, okay? So let's back up for a second. Bruce alluded to it, but the buyer is really an independent trustee, a fiduciary, okay? And according to the Department of Labor, they can pay up to, but not exceeding, fair market value for the business. So they need to understand what that limit is. So what they do is they turn to an independent valuation firm. And it's typically not just any valuation firm. They have to have experience in ESOPs. They have to, be credible, have all the proper accreditations and so forth. And that valuation firm represents them in the transaction to prepare the report. Okay? We, on the other hand, are representing the client. So what we do is we invest a lot of time going into the business up front. It could be 4 to 6 weeks, is not uncommon, where we go into the business and we really dig around it to understand how the operations work, what kind of equipment they have, the machinery, their process, what are the opportunities to improve the process. We want to understand the customer base. Who are the customers? Do they have one big customer, or do they have, a diversity of customers here? Do they have large capital expenditures coming up? We want to understand the historical performance of the business, because that always relates to the future performance. They go hand in hand. History is always the best predictor of the future. So we really invest a lot of time in that for a couple of reasons. Number one, we want to make this an organized process. We don't want this to be a 3-ring circus where you get all those different 8 constituents involved. They're all asking different questions, and there's concerns and so forth, and it slows the process down, okay? But secondly, and Bruce talked about this earlier, one of our jobs is to create the argument for value, all right? We want to represent our client to get them the best possible transaction. So you only can do that by rolling up your sleeves and doing your homework. So by spending that time up front, we understand what their issues are as well as they do. We get them out in a CIM, a confidential informational memorandum, and we talk about it. The pros and the cons. Like Bruce said, every business has strengths and it has weaknesses. Let's get that all out on the table, and let's show the weaknesses in the most favorable light, but being honest about it, and then promote the strengths. So I'm going to give an example right now. We have a client, wonderful business. Anyone would love to own this company, makes money hand over fist each year, and has done it for decades. The only problem is they have 3 customers, all right? They have a revenue concentration issue. One of the 3 customers actually makes up 90% of their sales. So anyone looking at this from the outside would say, oh my gosh, is this business even a going concern here? If you only have one customer driving the vast majority of your business, and that customer leaves, what do they really have? How can you value this at a high multiple of earnings? So in that situation, our job was to really understand that relationship and be able to articulate to everyone, the trustee and the trustee's financial advisor, why it wasn't an issue. So for them, we figured out, okay, they have a few advantages. Number one, they've had a lengthy relationship that started back in the 90s, and that's meaningful. Number two, they have a freight advantage because they have their warehouse located in a very close proximity to the warehouse of their largest customer. Number three, the largest customer is shipping goods away from their warehouse. So they have deadhead space usually in their trucks, which is very expensive. Our customer can fill those trucks up with their product, making a savings, generating a savings. So it's little things like that. And also, there's the USDA involved. This is a food products company. So even if their main customer wanted to move away or divest, it would be years before they could get a similar facility up and running. So by doing that homework and creating that background story, we help mitigate that risk that the trustees team and their valuation team would potentially assign to it. And that's just one example. The examples go on and on and on. But that's part of the process, is creating the argument for value, organizing all the information that we know both the trustee and the valuation firm will ask for upfront, so that when it's time to go through that diligence process, it goes smoothly, it goes quickly. We've prepared the client for all the questions they're going to encounter, and they know how to handle it. The other issues are the projections. The projections for the business served as the foundation for the valuation, okay? And the projections are always related to the past, because the past is the best predictor of the future. Now, it's up to management, and let me be clear about this, it's up to management to prepare those projections. That's not our job. All we do is we review what they've done, and we give them feedback, and we tell them to support their assumptions, and maybe we talk about why their assumptions could be too high or they could be too low. But by the end of this process, it's thoroughly vetted, and it should stand up to any scrutiny from any of the individuals on the buy side, okay? So back to the valuation. Evaluation consists typically of an income approach, a market approach, and an asset approach, okay? And depending on the particulars of a business, sometimes you throw out the asset approach. For instance, if you had a steel mill with a lot of PP&E, you'd want to consider the hard value of those assets. But if you have, a distribution company, they might lease their warehouse and might have a few forklifts, so they don't have a lot of assets. So the valuation firm will rely on the income approach and the market approach. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and go a little bit deeper, but does anyone have any questions? No. All right. So the next slide here is really a high-level example of the income approach. And the income approach is essentially an exercise to take the future expected cash flows and apply a net present value formula to them to figure out what they're worth today, okay? So you can see up top here, we have a base year in 2016 where their sales are 20 million and their EBITDA is 2 million and their after-tax cash flow is about $1.1 million, okay? And then management projected forward 6 years going forward. And it's based off of a series of assumptions. We kept it simple for this case and assumed that sales grow at 8% and EBITDA grows at 8%. And once again, as Bruce said earlier, EBITDA is just a proxy for cash flow, okay? And in this case, we'd work with management. Why is it 8%? Why is it not less? Why isn't it 2% or more? Maybe it should be 12%. The management might say, well, we've opened up a new market in the southwestern United States, or we have new customers. Or if you look back historically, our sales trend up nice and evenly, 8 to 10% a year, and we're going to choose 8% because it's the lower end of the range. So all of that gets documented, and it gets supported with footnotes and financial analysis that goes into a data room to support all of this, all right? Now in the lower left-hand corner, we have a box. Hold on here. These two slides blend together. Okay, the lower left-hand corner, you might not be able to see it very well, but it's called the weighted average cost of capital. And essentially, it's just a proxy for what the discount rate should be in calculating the net present value. And it's unique to each company, okay? And it's unique for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it's based off of, the debt to equity mix of the capital structure. Companies with more debt tend to have a lower cost of capital because debt is relatively inexpensive, whereas companies with more equity have a higher weighted average cost of capital because equity is very expensive. It's the risk money, okay? Yes?
Do you use what the company's debt and equity ratios are, or do you use what the market is?
It's generally a combination of both. What you like to see is an industry average of what the debt to equity ratio is. But sometimes if a company has a good reason for something that's a lot different, we'll take that into consideration. But that's a great question.
And we have Nick Sepnewski in the back there who does ESOP valuations coming up on our panel. Save that for him. He'll give an answer we can really put the screws to his thumbs on. It'll be great.
Well, you may not want to ask that because it would take up the whole hour.
Yeah, that's the subject of the whole MBA class right there, in this little box, believe it or not. Yeah. Oh, you did?
Oh, okay.
Okay, gotcha. So in any event, this company, not to go too deep, 30% debt, 70% equity. And, like I said, the debt money is cheap, 2.2% after taxes. The equity money is a lot more expensive, about 21%. And for a small business, that's not unusual. If it was a larger, more stable business, you would see a lower cost of equity. And the blended rate, or what's known as the weighted average cost of capital, equates to 15% in this example. Now, taking that number, which is very important, we apply it as a discount rate to the future cash flows, okay? The first 5 years, which is always very important. And at the top of the second box, you can see the discounted or net present value of the first 5 years is $4.7 million. And then the residual value, which is the stream of cash flows that goes off into perpetuity after that, gets discounted at the rate again, and it comes to 8.4 million. And if you add those two together, you get the net present value of all the future cash flows, which is approximately $13 million. All right? Now, the right-hand box is simply taking that $13 million and expressing it in terms of an EBITDA multiple. So in this case, our base level EBITDA is $2 million. Divided into that 13 million shows you a 6.5 times EBITDA multiple. Okay? Moving on.
That 5 years that you were using as a guide for calculating your discounts, does that vary industry by industry?
It's typical to use 5 years and then to use a residual period after that. And part of the reason is after that 5th year, because of the discount rate and so forth, it has less and less meaning to it. And of course, who can see 5 years out into the future?
I was thinking the other way, if you have an industry that's a little bit more volatile, maybe only go 3 years, or is it always 5?
Nick will be a great person to ask, or this lady here, but we typically see 5 years. And I'm sure there's exceptions. Most of our clients start freaking out when they talk about projecting much beyond 1 or 2 years and say, who knows what the future holds? But you have to project something, right? And so typically what they do is they become more conservative than they actually should be, which deprives them of value. But that's their projections, and they need to own it. Okay, so moving on. This is the market approach, or what some people would, yes?
Are we supposed to have these sheets? Because my packet does not include the value, several of the papers.
Yeah, you're correct, and we didn't put all the slides in the sheets simply because we have some proprietary stuff that we did not want to distribute to everyone to take home, because sometimes we do that, and then other people walking around with our materials and go into potential clients. So a couple things we've kept behind.
Sure.
There's a reason.
It is hard to see on the monitor.
Yeah.
You can't follow, but it's just too.
Okay.
Well, we apologize for that. So this is market approach, or what some people would call the comparable transaction approach, which is simply, hey, just like a real estate appraiser does, they look at your house and they look at the neighborhood and they want to see what other similar homes have sold for. It's the same with the business. You can go out there and check surveys and find out what other similar companies have sold for. Now, the smaller the company, the less amount of information that's available. We have 2 examples here. One is from Pepperdine Private Capital Market Survey, and the other is from Pratt Stats. And you'll notice with Pepperdine, and I'm not going to go too deep in this, but the businesses tend to trade from 3 to 10 times EBITDA, with the average probably being in that 4 to 6 times EBITDA range, okay? And the same with Pratt Stats. So with Pepperdine, we look at this company as a business service. So I don't know if you can see this, but you have manufacturing, construction, consumer products, IT, all the different industries. And this falls into a business service. And based on its size, Pepperdine is saying similar companies sell for 5.5 times. Pratt's is very similar based upon the size and so forth. It also shows a 5.5 times multiple. Okay? So moving along. This is a summary page. In the upper left-hand corner, if you can see it, we average the income approach at 6.5 times with the market approach at 5.5 times to get a 6 times multiple on the business. All right? On the right-hand side, you can see that, hey, the pro forma EBITDA is $2 million times a 6 times multiple yields a 12 times enterprise value. Now, the enterprise value always needs to be adjusted to get to transaction value by adding back excess cash, which the seller gets to keep, but subtracting any long-term debt that the seller has to pay at the time of the transaction. So in this case, they had $500 in excess cash, $1.5 million in long-term liabilities to yield an $11 million transaction price. Okay?
Any questions on the valuation before we move to a little bit on taxation? Okay. The next section on this is taxation. And again, kind of very big pictures, ESOPs have 2 amazing tax advantages. That the entity ceases to be taxable if it's owned by an ERISA plan, and that you can sell tax-free if you utilize 1042. So the first slide here is the tax savings at the company level. This is, you sell and the next day you have 100% S Corp ESOP. What is the tax benefit to that buyer? And in our math, we have $2 million in EBITDA. It's not all taxable. We think in our example, there's 40 in depreciation and 60 in interest expense. So we have taxable income of 1.9 million and a tax rate of 45%. Well, if you got 39.6% federal at the highest bracket, and you've got state taxes, 45 is a couple points off, but it's pretty close. So year one, that would be $855,000 in tax that would be paid if you remained non-ESOP, but if you're an ESOP, you're just saving it. And then we said, okay, let's assume that we put a 5% discount rate on these future earnings. So we're taking it back to a present value. And the present value of these tax savings is almost $24 million in today's dollars based on the assumptions here. Why is this important? It's important because this $24 million more than pays the purchase price. I mean, the value of the company was $12 million unleveraged. So it's almost double. It's just the tax benefit. And in the early years, this tax benefit allows the company to pay off the sellers in their bank very, very quickly. And in later years, it accrues for the benefit of the employees as a group, who create a lot of wealth for themselves by being shareholders of a non-taxable company. And these are real dollars. I mean, a lot of things you talk about are theoretical. This isn't theoretical. Not paying the government's awesome, and this is what it adds up to. And when we do a company with 8 or 10 in EBITDA, which we regularly do, we see $100 million plus tax savings in projection in our tax analysis on behalf of clients on a regular basis. It's insane amounts of money, and the reason why is the government wants you to do this. That's really the answer. Okay? Going to the next page is the shareholder tax benefit. This page really begins to look at what happens if you use 1042 and what happens if you don't. And there's no reason you have to use 1042, it's optional. But The tax savings attributable to the Section 1042 on this $12 million hypothetical deal is about $2.8 million, and I'll take you through how we got there. So on the left side, the sale price is $12 million. We have a hypothetical basis of $500,000 for a gain of $11.5 million. Then we apply the federal capital gains rates, the state tax, and the local income tax, and we end up with total taxes of 2.8. And the truth is, this is a really efficient transaction. If you're getting 76.4% of the money, or $9,165,000 out of the $12 million, this is a really efficient transaction. There's nothing wrong with this. But if you look over on the other side, the ESOP side, you have the same $11,500,000 gain, but if you use 1042, you end up with zero tax. So you save $2,835,000. And we'll talk about how the 1042 works in a bit more. But look at the second bullet at the top. In a third-party sale, the company would have to sell for $16.5 million, or 8.25 times EBITDA, in order to have the result in after-tax proceeds as this transaction. So if you think about it as a seller, you're effectively getting a significantly higher valuation because of the tax benefit. And when you talk to clients, they say, well, I could sell for 7 times to the roll-up guy that I don't want to sell to, and ESOP's paying me 6.5, why should I do it? The answer is you do whatever you want, and I'd happily represent you selling for 7 times. But if you're in a position to take advantage of 1042, then you get way more money this way. And there's no question, and we haven't even begun to speak about the interest income you'll receive in this transaction. So the tax savings are material in terms of both the company, which we demoed at about $24 million, but now I'm showing the seller is saving about $2.8 million. And the way I say it about ESOPs is as follows. Where else does the Internal Revenue Code enable a tax-free buyer and a tax-free seller in the same transaction? I ask rhetorically to tax guys, and I started my career as a tax lawyer. And the answer always is nowhere else, because it's nowhere else. And the reason we have this in the code, I think, is because the government wants you to do this. Why? And this gets to maybe politics for a moment, but I think a lot of people worry about the wage inequality, wealth inequality in the United States. Having employees getting wealthier narrows the gap. They also worry about Social Security and can we afford everybody? This narrows their need for Social Security because they have other resources. And from the Republican and conservative side, people who don't like taxes, we're allowing this company to be tax-free, which is pretty cool, and we're allowing the guy who guaranteed that debt and started this enterprise and brought all these people in to sell tax-free. So there's a lot of policy behind the ESOP behind the ESOP rules. These rules I'm showing you are not new. 1998 was when the 100% S-Corp ESOP really came into being. These rules haven't changed in a really long time. So there's not like this is a moment in time of, gee, these just happened. And what's going to happen? No one knows the future. We don't. Nobody does. And there's a new president coming in, so nobody knows the future. But this is a long-term government incentive plan, which there has not at this time been any indication is going to change. And if you listen to the candidates, I don't think there's any great move afoot. And the ESOP community has a lobbying organization, which has done a terrific job of pushing the ESOP message throughout Congress to people who otherwise might not know. So there's a lot here.
I do want to mention if you typically a third-party buyer would want to buy assets, and if it's a C corp.
Well, we don't have a C corp here, but Mike makes the point quietly, I think, which is if you represent a C corp, and remember they pay their own taxes, then dividend the money up. Most buyers, and myself as a buyer, I want to buy assets because I want to step up and basis those assets so I get goodwill, and I get the benefit of amortizing that goodwill in the future and stepping up the physical assets to their fair value, not their tax depreciation value, which is quick. I want that step up because it means I pay less tax in the future as a buyer. In an ESOP setting, well, you don't have to worry about the buyer trying to force you to bad tax outcome by buying your assets instead of your stock, because the ESOP trustee only buys stock. And that means I, as the seller, can escape the really tough tax situation that would otherwise occur. And that's the Bob Lyons situation where, you know, he more than doubled his after tax by selling stock and not having that problem. The next page, which is the last of my section on taxation, if you're going to elect 1042, then the section 1042, the Internal Revenue Code, you can all read it. It says you have to buy qualified replacement property, known as QRP. What is QRP? Well, it seems to me, again, people lobby for things. This seems to me Wall Street lobbied for this one, because you can't buy an ice cream stand. You have to buy publicly traded stocks and bonds. So if I bought Apple and I held, until I sell Apple, I don't pay tax. If I buy bonds until I flip, I don't pay tax. The other thing you can do is if you actively manage your own real estate, like I buy an apartment building and then hire a management firm, I can roll it into that too. And I know people who know a lot about real estate who say, hey, I can use 1042 and do real estate development with it, and they actually can. It's kind of cool. So here we are. The problem with what I just told you is, and it's cool, you can just buy a portfolio, but if you think Tim Cook's doing a bad job at Apple and you want to trade Apple, you're taking your gain that you just deferred. And some people don't want to pay the gain. In fact, they never want to pay the gain, and I think that makes them smart because the code allows that to happen. So what do? They buy an asset they'll never trade out of. There is an asset out there. The ESOP community, being kind of smart, realized that you could buy a 40-year duration bond. And if my 60-year-old seller is selling now and getting a 40-year bond, unless he's rather an optimist, it's going to last till he's no longer here. And you know what happens when you die under the Internal Revenue Code? You get a step up in basis. So if you marry this sale to that bond and your estate plan, you can sell, take back the proceeds, take those proceeds and buy the bond. Now, I don't want to sit on a bond forever. I want to buy a house in somewhere, and I want to put my grandkids through college, and I want to travel the world. No problem. The bond, you borrow the money out of the bond. And I could get very complicated here, but I think it's too much for this setting. But basically, I can borrow the money out of the bond and spend it on whatever I want. The analogy with real estate is real easy to understand. That building over there, I just bought it with my QR, that's my QRP. I borrow the money out in a mortgage, I spend on whatever I want. And I didn't trigger the gain, and I still own the money I take out. And most people put that into a portfolio of actively traded stocks and bonds, so they can do that. So we can get more into QRP if time permits at the end of this, but this is, it's really interesting, but it's sophisticated enough that we don't typically want to go down that in a presentation with this time duration. So, do we have any questions on the tax-free nature of 100% S-Corp ESOP post-transaction? Does that have any questions? Are there any questions on 1042, this tax-free rollover of proceeds? With no further ado, I'm going to turn over it to my partner Ted Lape, who had a long career as a commercial banker, and is going to talk now about, you know, the financial elements to the seller. So far, it's been theoretical. What does it mean to that seller? And he's going to take you through that.
Yeah, this is usually the part of the presentation where your client wakes up because here's the money they're going to get. So they get pretty excited. But just a little background, you may be familiar with kind of the old way of doing ESOPs where, hey, I'm thinking about doing an ESOP, so your attorney or accountant or somebody would introduce you to a valuation firm. And the valuation firm would come out and say, okay, here's what you're going to get. And then you'd kind of say, well, either that looks good or it doesn't look good. And if it looks good, then you'd go ahead and do the ESOP, and that valuation firm would be the valuation firm. Well, the Department of Labor, especially the last couple of years, has said, don't do that, because the valuation firm can't represent the seller and then turn around and represent the buyer. That's conflict of interest. They're not independent. Don't do that. So people who are thinking about doing an ESOP, they need to know what the numbers are, right? Because they're not going to do anything without that. It's great to know theoretically there's tax benefits, but they want to know, well, you know, what am I going to get, okay? So there's sort of two ways people go about doing that. Usually they'll come to an investment bank. And to tell them that, but the two ways the investment bank does it is either, it's kind of like if you're thinking about selling your house, they come out and they give you a number too high to get you excited about selling, and then it comes in somewhere lower and you know, kind of got excited about selling, so you do it anyway. What we do is we kind of do it the other way. We come in a little bit conservative, and every one of our deals, the final numbers have come in better than we told people, and that way, you know, they can be pretty sure what they're going to get. So that's kind of how we like to approach it. And our referral sources have said, gee, you know, people are charging $15,000 to do this. We don't really want to do that. We want you to do it for free, so these people can decide whether they want to do it or not, and so we do that. So this is kind of what we show them. So if you look on the left side, you know, what are the sources? Where's the cash coming from to do this? Well, in this case, there's excess cash of $500,000. Now, in an M&A deal, a lot of times you get in a big fight over that. People say, well, gee, if you had cash on your balance sheet, you must have needed to have that on the balance sheet, and therefore I, as the buyer, get that. Well, no. And then you get in a big fight, and you figure out how much of that they really get. In an ESOP, what we've done is if the company is going to have liquidity, it's going to have a line of credit, and it's going to make money after the close, they should get that excess cash. And everyone sort of agrees with that. So that extra cash is part of what the seller gets. Also, a bank will lend some money. Now, we've done, we've been very successful getting banks excited about ESOPs. They're all, you know, banks are actually our biggest referral source because they really like ESOPs, a lot of them. And so in this case, as they look at this company, there's not a lot of assets, right? So we have to convince them, hey, they have sustainable cash flow. We have to talk about the threats to the cash flow and why they can be comfortable that they're going to get their money back. And we do that, and typically on a consulting firm with no assets, they'll get 1.5 to 2 times that EBITDA that they talked about, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. In other words, cash flow. So they'll get 1.5 to 2 times that cash flow. In this case, we're using 1 3/4 times. So a bank's going to lend $3.5 million. There's $500,000 from the company, and then there's a plug figure, which is the seller note. The seller, whatever they can't get in cash, they take a seller note for. Now, as you're going to see later, the good news is they get a really nice return on that seller note. They get about a 12% return on that seller note, which is a lot, which is good. It happens to be below market. Market for a firm like this might be 16%. So the trustee's fine because they're getting a good deal at 12%, and the seller's fine because 12% is a lot more than they would normally get, right? So the sources are cash, bank loan, and this seller note. On the uses side, you got to pay off your existing debt because when you sell a company, you're selling it cash-free, debt-free. So you got to pay off the existing debt of $1.5 million. There's the closing costs that have to be paid. Now, the good news is in an ESOP, those costs are paid by the buyer, by the company. So what happens is normally cash would go out to pay those costs, and it would reduce what the seller gets. In this case, what happens is the seller gets a little bit less cash at close, but it gets added to the seller note. Okay, so the seller still gets the full purchase price. If you'll notice, the cash to sellers and the seller note together equal that $11 million, which is what we said the value was earlier. Okay, so they're not paying the closing costs, the buyer is. And so on the uses side, the seller's getting the cash at close of $1.9 million in the seller note. The closing costs are going out to everyone involved in the transaction, and then you have the existing term loan getting paid off. Okay, does that make sense? Sources and uses on a transaction. This is pretty typical. Okay. Now, if you go to the next page, Mike, I don't know if we're going to do that. You'll see on the capital stack, you got a bank loan, and then you got the seller note behind the bank loan. Now, the bank loan, typically, what we try to do is we try to get as long an amortization as possible on that term loan because usually people who do ESOPs are slightly conservative people who haven't borrowed a lot and have really good companies. So by getting a longer amortization, the mandatory payments on the term loan are lower, okay? So we convince the banks to do as long an amortization as possible. In this case, there's no assets at all, so getting them to do a 5-year term loan's a pretty good deal. And then what we do is we have them get paid back from extra cash that's there at the end of the year because the company's tax-free, okay? So you're gonna see that coming up, sort of how that works in a second, but you have the bank loan. And then behind that, you have a seller note. And the seller note normally is gonna get about 2% in current interest, and then about 10% in accrued interest, okay? Because there's not a lot of assets here, so the bank's saying, hey, I don't want you to get a bunch of money before I get my money. So the bank's gonna get their money first, and then you're gonna get your money, the seller is. And that's why the seller can get that higher interest rate, is because they're behind the bank, okay? So that's the basics. Now, if we go to the next page, you can see that interest.
Hey, Tim,
Yeah.
do you want to mention the personal guarantee issue?
Oh, yeah. Great point. In none of our deals do the seller ever guarantee the debt. Okay, so these are not personally guaranteed because the seller is selling. Now, back to your question about a partial ESOP, if you did a 30 or 40% ESOP, they're probably going to make the seller guarantee the debt. Okay, but in 100% ESOP, I don't own it anymore. Why would I guarantee it? And so they don't guarantee it.
And the other issue is if you were to compare that to a MBO, management buyout, where typically just a few key employees were trying to acquire the business, they'd end up going to a bank, borrowing money, and would definitely have to personally guarantee the loan. And for a lot of situations, that's a conversation stopper. It's a showstopper because they just don't want to do that. So,
Yeah.
although it doesn't go to just a few people in an ESOP, there is no PG.
And I guess I was gonna ask that kind of question, if banks are demanding a personal guarantee on those notes, does that kind of kill your deals? Does that change the whole risk structure of things that makes it viable, or is it a good planning technique, or?
Well, the good news is we have banks fighting over this, and rarely do they ask for it, and if they do, we don't laugh at them, but we tell them, hey, here's 4 other banks that don't need that. Do you really need that? And then they end up mysteriously not needing it.
Also, note that the cash flow available for debt service doubled because they're not paying tax. So when you think about what's known as an airball loan, this is a consultancy, there's no collateral, a little bit of receivables. The collateral for that term loan is air, known as an airball, right? That airball loan is amortized in half the time. So if you have a bank that says, we're doing 1 to 2 times airballs in terms of multiples of EBITDA, well, here it's effectively a half to 1 because of the speed with which you pay it off. So I think the lenders are sophisticated and understand the advantage to that. And they also understand you've got a seller note holder with big money left in this game day one. And that if it really needed support, you have somebody who might really try to help it, but not obligated to, not in a personally guaranteed sense.
Yeah.
Would it still kill the, I mean, if you got a bank that says, nope, we're gonna do it this way, you're gonna guarantee it, would you continue to proceed?
We would get a different bank because I could tell you 6 banks off the top of my, 12 banks that
But
wouldn't.
it's dumb to do it if there's a guarantee.
Yeah, absolutely, I would
It's-
never do that.
It's like a leverage recap. If I own a company, ignore ESOPs,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna personally guarantee the debt to get it off the table, I don't even know why you do it.
I don't know why you would either.
I'm with you 100%. If you had a personal guarantee, the answer is, to me, why you doing that? I would just take back an all seller note, prove that we couldn't get any non-recourse financing, and take the 12 points on more money. But we've never run into that, ever,
Yeah.
just for clarity.
And sometimes you're talking to the wrong person at the bank. They just don't understand. And then you got to get them to the right person.
Yes.
You are looking at a transaction that's basically unsecured. Is there a minimum debt service coverage ratio the banks are looking for on that?
Well, that's a great question. Now, when you say unsecured, it's secured but uncollateralized, you mean?
Basically an airball.
Airball, yeah. Normally they're going to creep up the fixed charge coverage, if you're familiar with that term, or debt service coverage. Now, I try to make the case that, hey, 1.0 means you're meeting all your debt, so 1.1 means you got a cushion. Why do you need more than 1.1? And they try to make it like, 1.5, because the cash flow on ESOPs is almost always like 2 times because there's no taxes, right? So we'll argue to get that down. Usually it might be 1 1/4 or something like that, even though they're around 2 times, because we want to give them a lot of cushion. Okay, so real quick on 23, you'll see there's a lot of interest there. They got 11 million of principal and 3.7 million of interest, which gets you to 14.7. So earlier, Bruce had mentioned earlier, you're talking about a case where the guy took less money to do an ESOP. In our experience, normally the seller ends up with more money in an ESOP than he would in another transaction. It's just he's getting it over, or she's getting it over 4, 5, 6 years, because all this interest gets added onto it. Okay, so when you add the interest to the principal, usually they're going to end up with a little bit more money. Now, I will mention, some of you may be familiar with, there's something you can get instead of interest that is called warrants. And I don't want to get into that right now because it's kind of like a stock option. So there's sort of 2 ways to get your return, interest or warrants. And if anyone really wants to learn more about that, I can talk about that. Most of our clients go with interest because it's a sure thing, it's simpler, etc. But I can talk, if anyone wants to get into that other thing. So in this case, you see there's a lot of extra return there. If we go to page 24, you can see the owner in this case is basically getting chunks of cash every year. Now, how are they doing that? Well, you're going to see on the next page when we get to that, it's because they're refinancing every year. Because they're tax-free, they're paying down the debt so fast, the bank's saying, hey, I really like outstanding loans, and they're going to them and saying, okay, let's refinance it every year, and that gives them chunks of cash. And we've sort of broken out in this slide here, interest and principal, et cetera. But the nice thing for the owner is they're getting these chunks of cash every year. And you can see by the end of year 4, there's a dotted red line there showing you that by year 4, they have price. And then year 5, they get a bunch of extra interest, okay? So in 4 years, they have the purchase price. In that 5th year, they have that extra money we talked about, that $3 million extra. So they're getting their money pretty darn quickly, and they're still running the company. Which is a good thing. Any questions on that? No? On the next page is sort of how the seller note and the bank work, okay? So this is quarterly. You see those blue bars quarterly? That's that seller note growing. Remember, they're getting 2% current interest, 10% accrued. So that's that seller note growing at that 10%, and it grows a lot, okay? The red line is the bank, okay? So remember, we've got that flatter part of the red line is that low mandatory payment. And then at year end, the bank's going in and scooping half that extra cash. And remember, there's a bunch of extra cash because the company's tax-free. So the bank scoops half that extra cash, pays down the loan, and then the loan's paid really low, and then the bank wants to lend again. So they re-lend, give a bunch of money to the company, and the company pays down the seller note. So if you look at the seller notes, the blue bars, the seller note every year goes down, and then it grows again, and then it goes down, and then it grows again, and it goes down and grows again. It just kind of repeats itself. The bank gets paid down, re-loans gets paid down, re-loans gets paid down, okay? So that's generally how we see it working. Okay?
One thing I'd like to add is, Ted mentioned it earlier, but I want to emphasize this. If we have a loan at 2 times funded debt to EBITDA, let's say $4 million on a $2 million EBITDA company, we'll typically have an amortization of 5 years on that loan. So if you think about it, the mandatory pay downs are very low relative to the expected cash flow. So there's not a liquidity tightness for the seller, for the company. And the other thing that is important also is we always get a line of credit as part of these transactions, typically with this, in a consultancy like this, with a 0 draw. So if they average, let's say they average $1 million in receivables, so I'm making up a number for a point, and you'd have an 80% advance rate, that's $800,000. They'll have $800,000 of additional untapped liquidity at closing. That plus the very slow amortization of debt, meaning there's a tremendous cushion relative to their liquidity, because the most important thing in the world for a company is liquidity. I mean, accrual profits are cool and all, but liquidity's king. You know, cash is king. So we build them for tremendous liquidity so that they aren't going to have cash flow problems. And I just wanted to point that out. I'm sorry, Dave.
Yeah, so that's sort of how that, the pay down of the debt works and the seller note. And you'll see eventually the seller note gets paid off. And then the red line eventually gets paid off as well. So eventually you have a debt-free company that's generating a lot of cash because they're tax-free. And what you see at that point is either the company starts accumulating a lot of cash, or a lot of times they'll look at acquisitions because they become very good acquisition vehicles. Because if they buy someone, whoever they buy becomes tax-free, and they're very attractive as kind of a friendly buyer. And they can offer that seller that 1042 tax-free sale. So anyway, a lot of cash starts to get generated, very good companies. If you look on 26, though, you're going to see a whole bunch of numbers. I wouldn't get too caught up in all the numbers. The key point here is if you look at the first year, 2017, there's $1 million of extra cash flow, okay? And the main reason for that is you're tax-free. And so I'll point you to two main numbers. One, you got $1 million of extra cash flow, and two, the debt service coverage ratio is 2 times, meaning the cash we're generating is twice as much as the cash we have to pay out in mandatory payments, okay? This is a much, much bigger cushion than I would ever saw as a banker. As a banker, normally they would have debt service coverage of like 1.4, meaning they had about a 40% cushion. On almost all of our ESOP deals, there's a 100% cushion. A lot of cushion. So these companies that you know that are well-run, conservative, you know, people doing things for the right reason, this makes them feel a lot better. Okay. Any questions on that? If anyone wants to go through more of the numbers in more detail afterwards, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Okay, so what you're looking at right now is a simple Gantt chart showing the timeline for the ESOP formation. And because this is a process with pretty much a certain outcome, you can show this to the client. And the client will hold you accountable to it, frankly. So there are 3 different parts. The preparation part, which is where we're putting all the information up front. We're diligizing the business, anticipating the issues, helping the client to come up with their response so that later when they have to meet with the trustee and the valuation firm, they've already dealt with this. They know the key questions that are going to be asked. They know the information that's going to have to be prepared and presented. And it's all organized in a nice data room, which everyone has access to, which will make the process go a lot smoother. And once again, we've done this so many times, we just have a good sense on how the diligence process works. And by doing the work to understand the business, we can figure that out. What issues are important, what issues aren't, how to create the argument for value, and you know, what information we need to gather. So in the preparation phase, which really takes about 6 weeks, we spend really about a month or so gathering the background information and drafting a book with management's help. Management prepares their own projections. They, towards the end of that process, need to hire their company ESOP counsel to help them guide them through the transaction. And once they have that done, they, you know, kind of have the basics of their sell-side team in place. The second portion is the formation process. That's where they're going to interview trustees, and the best practice is to interview 3 different trustees. And based upon the size of the business, the issues that are involved, we make recommendations on who they should interview. And it's generally an hour-long conversation. Most of it is on phone because the trustees are scattered all over the country. We're conducting an interview tomorrow for a client. One trustee is in Indiana, another is in Minnesota, and the third is in Los Angeles, and it's all done via phone. From there, they select a trustee they want to work with. They sign an engagement agreement. The trustee's job then is to select an independent valuation firm to act as their financial advisor, which we discussed earlier in the presentation. And then the diligence begins. It starts with a meeting, usually at our office or on the company's site, depending on how secretive the client wants to be. It lasts generally 3 to 4 hours, and that's where the buy-side team, led by the trustee and the valuation firm, review the materials that have been presented to them, and they ask a series of questions. They want to understand more about the business. They want to hear directly from the owners of the company about the history, and more importantly, what their intentions are going forward. It's, as Bruce said, it's a very collegial process as opposed to adversarial. And I tell many of our clients before the meeting that, hey, relax. This is not an IRS audit. You will actually enjoy this. And they laugh at me and they scoff and they're like, whatever. But by the end of it, they're like, hey, I kind of had fun. I got to talk about my business. I got to tell my story, and that was enjoyable. And, part of it's because they're well prepared going into that meeting. All the issues have been dealt with up front, and they're on the table. There's good answers for them, and, it avoids any last-minute surprises. From there, then, the trustees team, including the trustees' attorney and valuation firm, act as the buyer, and we start preparing a term sheet. That is the seller and the seller's attorney and Lazier Capital's partner will draft a term sheet to sell the business. It's kind of opposite of if you were selling to a third party, because if you're selling to a third party, the third party makes the offer. In ESOP land, the selling shareholder makes the offer to the ESOP. And the trustee then goes back and forth and starts negotiating, on price and on terms in the term sheet. And it generally takes, 5 to 7 terms of the term sheet until all the parties agree on the particulars. The term sheet's signed from there. And then right around then we bring in a third-party administrator. Generally, that's Crow. Crow does an excellent job. They're here in Columbus, and yet they have ESOP clients all over the country. I think 750 ESOPs, so they do good work, and they're also able to help explain to the clients, not from a legalistic standpoint, but more from a functional standpoint, how to structure their ESOP plan, what it means for the average participant. And they can run projections. They have different scenarios they can talk about at a real live level that, they're best suited to speak to. From there, oh yeah. Tim? Yeah, the feasibility study is what we incur upfront. You're looking at a lot of it. And it's designed to give the client an idea of, hey, this is what a sale to an ESOP would look like, and answer a lot of their questions. And that is at the very front end of the process. And it's designed to, give them a level of certainty as to what would happen if they chose this path of an ESOP.
And everything behind you is after the feasibility analysis and the client said, I want to proceed. So for clarity, there may be a month prior to this when we're meeting them and they're giving us information, sometimes even months, plural, if they have trouble with the 5-year projection because they're trying to decide what they believe the underlying assumptions are. So just for clarity, this is after that.
Yep. So in any event, going on here then, so after the term sheet's signed, the attorneys really take over from there, and they start drafting the documents, whether it's the plan document, the stock purchase agreement, the bank loans, and that's really a race to the finish, and it generally takes about 1 month's time. We're there to support the effort, answer questions, facilitate the conversation, make sure that all of the 8 constituents to the transaction are communicating and actually working together.
I just add one thing there. The term sheet itself, I use the term sheet as a lawyer, and it could be a very simple memorandum of understanding. These are not. The term sheets in our transactions are very definitive, so much so that there's very little negotiation of the documents with changes, because the term sheet, like I talked about, indemnities, baskets, duration, scope, all those things are the term sheet. The term sheet's probably 13, 15 pages commonly, and it really is almost a mini transaction document in and of itself, so that when counsel begins drafting the actual transaction documents, they almost fall off the page because all the negotiation is basically behind us at that point. And that's unusual as compared to a typical M&A transaction where you'd have a letter of intent, which would say we have exclusivity for the benefit of the buyer, and here's generally the terms, subject to diligence. This is really definitive in its scope. And we sometimes negotiate those term sheets to the last several weeks of the transaction because the transaction documents really aren't the burden at this point. Next, Ted, oh, do you have something else in this? We're about to take over on SARS. Yeah, Ted's going to talk about stock appreciation rights. And earlier at the very beginning, I said key employees really are important. There's something in it for them, not just their ESOP shares. And Ted's going to talk about that.
Yeah, so as investment bankers, and actually, guys, we own some companies ourselves, we get very excited about what the seller gets. Seller gets all these tax advantages, they get a bunch of money, they get a bunch of extra interest, they get to keep running it. We talk a lot about what the seller gets. And sometimes I think we don't talk enough about what's in it for the employees. And so normally what we hear is the seller's concerned about the employees and wants the employees to do well, but they really, really care about the key employees because they've made promises to them. They think they're the people driving the business. They're the ones that they really want to make sure get taken care of. And the key employees are usually like the head of sales, the CFO, the head of operations, people like that. Now, naturally, they get more in an ESOP because if they make $150,000 and someone else makes $50,000, they get 3 times as much stock, because stock's allocated based on what you make. But normally, the seller wants more to go to those people. Okay, and so we've spent a lot of time talking to valuation firms about what can we give to the key employees without lowering what the seller gets. Okay, analogous to when a private equity firm buys a company and does carried interest. So what we've come up with that works for both the buyer and the seller is on stock appreciation rights, which are kind of like stock options for the key people. Okay. And so there's 2 types. There's retention stock appreciation rights, which is, hey, key employee, if you stick around for 5 years, we're going to give you these stock options. There's another type that incentivizes those key people to beat projections. Those are called performance stock appreciation rights. And what we'll typically see is up to 5% of the value of the company can go to these key employees for sticking around, and up to 10% can go to these key employees if they can beat projections, okay? And that really aligns the trustee, the buyer, and the employees with the seller. So in this example, we've quantified that, and we try to do that in most deals because it's a lot of money. So you'll see by year 5, the company's worth almost $12 million. Now, a big part of that, what's helped a lot, is obviously the company's tax-free, and as it pays down all that debt, it creates a lot of equity. So you got a $12 million value company. Well, guess what? Almost $700,000 of that value is accreted to the key employees just for staying around 5 years to make sure this whole thing works. And then there's up to there's approximately $1.4 million available to employees if they can beat projections during those years. And it could be bigger because obviously if you're beating projections, the value of the company is worth even more. So there's a lot of value there for the key employees to incentivize them to work hard and create value for all the employees. And this is a key part. The other thing I want to mention is there's been a lot of third-party peer-reviewed studies that study ESOPs and say, okay, do ESOPs work? Do they make companies better? And what it's shown is a lot more sales per employee, more profit per employee, less turnover, happier employees, et cetera. And of course, it matters based on how much you communicate to the employees and you embrace it and you really work the ESOP. And if you do that stuff, you get all that. Quick example, 2 seconds, and then I think it's break time, is we did an ESOP for a consulting firm here in Columbus. And they're sort of a virtual consulting firm. They've got people around the country. But the president of that firm had been the COO of Perot Systems. And really, really on it guy who measured everything. I mean, measured down to the gnat. And what he found was in the first year, they had a 4% increase in productivity attributable to the ESOP. And they had some young stars that were being recruited by Toyota to go into their management program and make big money. And those people told him they normally would have gone, but they were going to stay with the company because of the ESOP. And I've had, I can't tell you how many attorneys come up to me and say, you guys don't realize for millennials how important this thing is. Millennials want to have a say in what's going on. They want to have some ownership, and it's perfect for them. And recruiting and retention is a big deal. So SARs are something that become very, very important to a lot of our sellers.
All right, we're now at the time for our break. We'll come back at 3 o'clock, and we're going to have our panel discussion. So I would ask our panel members to come up front, and they can get settled in, and then we'll go till 4:15, and then we will have a cocktail hour. So thank you.
No tapping, lean in.
All right, let's get
One
this.
second, please.
Let's get started. I'd first like to introduce our panel members. I'm going to ask them to just give a little summary about where they work, what they do, and how that fits in the ESOP transaction process. Right here is David Whaley. And David, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I'm David Whaley. I'm a partner at Thompson Hine in Cincinnati. I'm an employee benefits attorney by trade. I spend about 30-40% of my time doing ESOP work. Inside of the ESOP space, what I routinely will do is I'll actually represent the trustee in some transactions. So Tracy will introduce herself. Represent the company in other transactions whenever we're sort of, as Bruce was saying, quarterbacking the transaction from the attorney point of view. And then after transactions, we do a lot of work and assistance with respect to the administration, operation, and compliance aspects of the retirement plan. And realize since you're talking about a lot of 0 to 100% transactions, what you've really done is modify the governance structure with respect to the company itself. And so you're really working with companies to try to figure out what their revised governance structure really looks like after a transaction and sort of running their own company. It does make us a level of not only employee benefits attorneys, but also corporate attorneys. But a lot of times we're sort of really counselors inside of that role, trying to help companies move forward through a transaction and then after a transaction.
And next we have Tracy Woolsey. Tracy, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Well, as she said, I'm Tracy Woolsey. I'm from Horizon Trust and Investment Management. We do the trustee role within an ESOP transaction. We actually have a national practice. We do this with a lot of ongoing clients and for the actual transaction, and are very involved in the various ESOP organizations. That'll probably be the best way to phrase it, and very involved in the community. We have been doing it since 1986, but we have really started specializing in it since the early 2000s. And we're what's called an institutional trustee, which means we're actually backed by an institution, which would be the bank, versus an individual that may act as trustee, as an independent trustee.
Thank you. And next we have Tom Dunson.
Hi, my name's Tom Dunson. I'm with First Merchants Bank, and we are the lending side of the ESOP transaction. I've been with the bank for about 28 years, was also outside of the bank for another 7 years, helping a company operate here in Columbus. We've been active in the ESOP role for several years and have done a lot of transactions and have done a lot of work with Lazier, and anxious to talk to you all about the financing side of it.
Great. And next is Nick Sipniewski.
So I'm Nick Sipniewski with Comstock Advisors. We're a business valuation firm with offices in Cincinnati, Chicago, and Winston-Salem. We do valuations for a lot of reasons, but over 60% of our work is related to ESOPs, and we actually happen to be a 100% ESOP-owned company ourselves.
Now, what we'd like to do is look at the ESOP transaction from the perspective of our panelists, the trustee's perspective, the valuation firm perspective, the legal perspective, and the lender's perspective. And we'd like this to be an interactive discussion, so please feel free to ask questions of any of our panelists, and our panelists are free to jump in when other panelists are speaking, and we'd like to have a little conversation going on here. Tracy, From the trustee's perspective, what we hear a lot from clients is, if I do an ESOP transaction, is the trustee going to be running the day-to-day operations of my business? Could you speak to that?
I always smile when I hear that question, because that is probably one of the biggest fears, and two, the most common questions we get. My response is pretty consistent. You don't want me running your business. They don't want me running their business. That's not what I do. I'm a fiduciary. I'm not the business owner. I'm not in whatever industry they may be in, and we work with a lot of different industries. Where we actually operate more is at a board level, because we're an outside shareholder at that point in time. So we are really acting as an outside shareholder would act, not as the management, not as the day-to-day operations. The board oversees management. Having said that, we do have quite a bit of contact with them when we do the updates, because we actually have to value that stock every year, so we have contact with management, but we have no intentions of running companies. And they never turn the keys over to us, and the only time they ever want to do that usually is when the business is going badly. That's usually when they try to turn things over, but they still have to manage it.
So Tracy, you talked about the board. How is the board of directors of the company selected in an ESOP?
It varies based on a few ways. We usually look at the bylaws to determine who actually does select the board, how that's actually put together, if there's a nominating committee, if there's not a nominating committee within the board itself. Oftentimes it's an internal committee of the company that puts that together. It can really vary. We just have to make sure we're following what the rules are for the individual company. Actual voting of the stock, we can either be directed on how to vote the stock by an internal committee of the company, which could also be the board of directors themselves, or we can have the discretion on how we actually vote that stock too, and that comes down to what it says in the ESOP plan document.
Can you explain discretionary versus directed for folks who aren't familiar with the terms?
He asked if I explained directed versus discretionary. In a directed case, there's actually, typically it's an internal group within the company. It's not necessarily the board, but as a default, it becomes the board. They actually put together a direction letter and tell us how they want us, what actions, specific actions they want us to take. And that can actually pertain to the voting of the company stock. In a discretionary situation, we're actually utilizing our fiduciary discretion to determine if we are going to vote for those individual board members that are put forth before us. So that's usually when you hear someone talking about directed versus discretionary trustee, that's what that specific item is what they're referencing. There are lots of other things that you will find we are not directed on. For example, we will not be directed on setting the share price. We require we're discretionary on that, because there's not any clear guidance as far as if you can actually eliminate your fiduciary responsibility from that perspective. But we're always required that we're directed on what payouts to make to participants, because we do not have the information as far as distributions, what's in the individual account balances, those types of things, so we are directed as far as how to pay those out.
Tracy, what are the company's reporting obligations to the trustee after an ESOP transaction?
Reporting obligations can really vary from our perspective. If we have a struggling client, we can request additional information. So if our investment, just like if you would have any other investment, you might look at it more often if they're actually having problems. We may be having monthly conversations with them. What they're actually legally required, well, legally, I don't know if I'd say legally required. When we actually have to have direct contact is when we're setting that stock price, assuming it's not publicly traded. So they have to provide us all of the data to be able to analyze the company and look at what's happened in the last year, what's happened, what do they see going forward, update a lot of the things that were done during the transaction. So they report all of that information to us. We typically request that they give us information on a quarterly basis, just so we can understand what's going on at the company. We'll have phone conversations with them. They will contact us whenever big things happen within the company, typically. So you're looking to acquire somebody, the CEO's been let go, those types of things are things when, if you had an outside 100% shareholder, you're probably going to pick up the phone and call them. That's usually, that's kind of what the line is. And they just call us if they have questions.
Great. Speaking of questions, I see some questions in the audience. Yes?
Owners tend to be somewhat creative in the way they run their companies when it's just them. When they get you involved as a trustee, Are you often put in a position where you have to say, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that? Or is that something that is totally below your level at that point?
Can you define creative?
But it deals with, financial structure, shareholder loans, all sorts of different ways they structure compensation or move things around within this, or multiple entities that make up something that may make up the whole business enterprise.
A lot of those things are negotiated right up front. So before we actually make the purchase, typically they're put under a contract, and a lot of those types of things are limited. So that's where a lot of that comes into play right from the get-go. So that the kind of the ground rules are established. At some point, the board is actually the one that they report to typically, and we require that they have an outside board member who can actually oversee some of that and make sure that there aren't any types of abuses. Where we will tend to have to be more involved is when the board is setting their own compensation, can sometimes become a little sticky, and we can have pretty extensive conversations about that.
I chime in on that, on this as well, because a lot of times you're right. Privately held businesses, the owners do what they want to do, and when we take a look at the value of a company, we look at the cash flows it's generating. So if you want to get top dollar for your company, you need to run the company in a way that is going to generate cash flow. Whereas if you want to have some of these other things that sometimes can take away from value, maybe that's okay, but you're not going to get paid for it on top of that.
And I think you end up taking some of that flexibility away, but that's part of the deal. We'll typically have an employment contract that will spell out a lot of the things about the compensation, vehicles, insurance, extra things that they used to do. It'll all be spelled out, negotiated up front.
Yes.
So the previous segment we talked about, or someone alluded to some studies on success rate of ESOPs. Specifically, when you get past that owner or driving force personnel leaving, so that the seller has retired now, what kind of success does this panel see in ESOPs?
Yeah, see, the challenge, I mean, and this is really an interesting challenge because we talk about this relationship between a selling shareholder and the company, and I'm sure Tracy can speak to this at some level. We see a lot of different transactions in a lot of different spaces. We'll see transactions where we have a selling shareholder that hasn't been involved in the company in 10 years. Well, they've already made that transition, right? They've already handed the company off to the next generation, and it turns out the ESOPs are really fantastic tax deferral, not avoidance. We were pointing this out in the back of the room. Bruce likes to say it's tax avoidance. Realize an ESOP is a tax deferral vehicle. Yeah. But to be able to get the company to the next generation inside the company, and so get it to the next generation of management, well, it's already been there in their hands. Other times we have these organizations that are massively founder-driven, sort of a founder problem, and the ability of the company to succeed is really the founder. And so a trustee's position in that, and the first story is, we're going to buy the selling shareholder out, and we really don't care they're ever here. We want nothing more than what their ownership position is going to be. The second is going to be the trustee is going to lock the seller into a 5-year employment agreement saying, you're going to be here because we need you here because you have made yourself so valuable with respect to the company. The theory of those studies are generally done by the NCEO. There are a lot of different trade organizations. The NCEO is the National Center of Employee Ownership. It's kind of the think tank portion of employee ownership or the ESOP space. And their work with respect to employee-owned companies are typically based on longer-term employee-owned companies in which selling shareholders have really exited the company. And the rationale behind it is that when you get to that spot of individuals that are employee owners, and realize those studies aren't necessarily just ESOPs. It's employee owners, so it's restricted share units, it's stock option plans, it's different programs that they're testing beyond employee stock purchase plans of public companies. Different programs they're testing just beyond ESOPs. And what their studies show is when you have broad-based employee ownership, and they're looking specifically for broad-based, not just ownership at the top. When you have broad-based employee ownership, you do make it more successfully through downturns, and you operate more efficiently on a go-forward basis because of the buy-in of employees. And so that's not necessarily just a standard or a result from individuals that are selling shareholders participating, and realize that's not every transaction anyway. It's really the thought of people buying in. But Ted mentioned this, and I think this is 100% correct, is it becomes a question of how much people buy in. We all have ESOP clients that I don't think the employees actually know that they're ESOPs. We all have ESOP companies that I have every Friday afternoon ESOP day. And so the amount by which people buy into the program really is dependent on the company, and how much sort of buy-in or buy-up you get from individuals or inside of that organization really depends on the culture you run from the company you have. And I just took a 1-minute question and made it 6 minutes because that's what attorneys do.
But I think that's a valid point, and it really depends on how much ongoing education you're doing with those employees. Because a lot of them think they now own a share of stock, they can tell everybody what to do with it. And it's no different than you owning a share of stock in some other publicly traded company. You're not gonna run that company. So it's a whole education process. It's continuing sharing the numbers, letting them know what the values really are doing. And we see the ones that really spend time on that tend to be more successful.
Let me ask a question. So if you walk into a company, it's a valuation issue, trustee, legal, it's everything, financing, and there's no identified successor. You got a guy who's 60, it's really important. He really does want his next generation to come along, but they're not there. How does it impact all of your views of how you approach that company for 100% ESOP transaction? Start with valuation.
Well, I mean, this isn't necessarily a valuation answer because we had this happen a couple months ago. The guy basically said, look, I want to move on and do my next big thing. I don't want to sell to a third party because they would, get rid of half the people because honestly, that's what the company needed to do. The company needs me to run, but I don't want to be involved. But just call, who puts the ESOP thing in place? We'll do one of those and that'll take care of it. We came with the value form, we just said, don't do it. You don't have any management succession. And whether this is ESOP or you're keeping this is true for any business that wants to perpetuate itself. Family-owned, ESOP, employee-owned. Everyone looks at the numbers, it's like you've got to have that management succession. If that's not there, at worst you say don't do it, and you're pretty much forced to sell, or you say you're going to have to get a management team in place. You're going to have to do the hard work, and that can't be done overnight. It's going to take some time, or you might have to hire somebody in. But I mean, I think it's a critical issue. A lot of times, business owners are looking at the numbers, looking at their tax situation, and haven't thought through their management succession, and that's not typically a 3-month fix.
Yeah, just real quick, can you explain how the ESOP might help them recruit the next level of management?
Well, sure. I mean, if you put an ESOP in place, and we've dealt with several where the reason they want to put the ESOP in place, despite all of the tax deferrals, is I really want to get my employees to be owners, especially that top tier of people. They want to have some skin in the game. They've helped build this thing. I'm going to get my money as a seller, but it really is a good motivation for employees in general. I will say to Ted's point earlier about SARs, that ESOPs are intrinsically very fair. And so we talked earlier about people not understanding that they're owners, so you're giving them ownership, and yet they're not necessarily appreciating it. In the meantime, your top management's getting basically the same percentage. Yes, it's based on their comp, but it's not this huge percentage the way the founder had it. And so it is good to be able to incentivize them to drive profits up and risk down and stock price up. And so those stock appreciation rights can become very important tools in making that happen and driving value.
I was going to say, having said that, during a transaction, it is something that we focus on very closely. We've actually written into plans where they don't have that they need to hit certain goals along certain timelines, and we want to talk about that and make sure that transition occurs very smoothly. And basically, the CEO can't step away until we're confident in their successor. It gets very interesting on an ongoing basis when you're at second-tier management who have now stepped up. We had an ESOP where the 78-year-old CEO was stating loudly and proudly that he was going to die at his desk. That was his management succession plan. He was going to die at his desk, which is fantastic for him, not so fantastic for us. And this is one of the reasons we actually like to talk to the board of directors on an annual basis, is we pointed out that there was actually a valuation issue associated with that because of the risk of, I think it's pretty obvious when you have a 78-year-old CEO, there's some potential risk of loss in
We call it
the near term.
actuarial, DB's defined benefit plans call it positive actuarial gain.
Yeah.
So
That had actually negatively impacted the valuation, and we had that conversation, and since then, they have since put into place, it was a new ESOP for us at that point, but they've now put into place a succession plan and have a plan in place and a structure as to what they're going to do to manage that. when that happens. That's not an if, it's a when at this point.
Yeah, and I think, Bruce, the interesting thing is that I think we see that issue more often in mature ESOPs than we see it in new transactions. In your scenario, I think that what would be a typical reaction would be the selling shareholder would probably be put in a 5-year employment agreement by the company, and the conversation would be bring the next people up. Let's see who you have here, but bring the next people up.
Or look outside.
Yeah.
So rather than precluding the transaction with my two 60-year-olds, it's more, we need a plan from the perspective of the people in the panel. We need a plan to show how you're going to get to that next level of management. We need to know you're going to stay, but it's not really a deal breaker. It's more you need to show us positive, momentum forward.
Right, and I guess I would also add, the one thing that seems that happens oftentimes is that from an operational line function, a lot of times these companies do have the management in place. I've got someone who can handle this, and this part of the day-to-day operations of the company, no problem. Sometimes it's the broader strategic, where's the business going? So that strategic leadership, the lack of it won't kill you today. It will hamper you in the long term. But again, for the owners and the current management, take an honest assessment of what do we have operationally, what do we have leadership-wise, and where are our holes, and fill them.
And I think that one of the other things you have to realize is you're talking about a company, and I think this is important, you're talking about a company that on a regular basis was drained of cash because it's being run for a family. It's being run for a singular owner. And if you're looking at succession, what you functionally are, is you're going to have some overlay. You're going to have a person that's hired into a role that is already filled by another individual. And so there's 6 months or 12 months of overlay with respect to compensation. And if you have an individual who has a short runway with respect to what they expect their timeline to be in the company, they're not very likely to say that I'm going to have overlay in a CFO position where basically I'm paying 2 people for 6 months or 12 months to do a CFO position so the person under can rise into that role. And so functionally what happens is sometimes in the transactions we have people that you're basically seeing, okay, now because of the transaction, we're actually going to be able to move forward with some succession planning that we might not have done otherwise whenever it was owned by John Smith 100% for his benefit.
Any other questions from our group from the trustees' perspective? Yes.
Sorry to be so many questions here.
Oh, no, we want questions.
So a few of these that I've touched, they don't hire an independent person like you, they hire a buddy. And as a trustee, an accountant that they know that they can influence.
We would call that a bad legal act.
I would say that's a
yeah.
bad idea, but
Yeah.
they're in it now, and that's where they are. But, you know, if that's what my client wants to do, says, oh yeah, I'm gonna bring my CPA, says, you're not doing an ESOP then. Is that a conclusion that you would draw? Or do you think that that kind of relationship can work? Because they're afraid of the fees, they're afraid of losing control, all that kind of stuff. And they wanna bring in somebody that they can somewhat control.
They're not legally prohibited from doing it. As a matter of fact, the seller can act as the trustee, as the company, and as the seller. Legally. Is it a smart decision? No. Because then the Department of Labor comes in and says, what have you done? And they kind of recreate. I mean, we've been brought in several of those situations where we've had to go back and fix everything. Obviously, I'm biased because I am, I'll own it, because that's what I do. But I don't know if I were personally, on an individual level, if I had someone like that, if I would feel comfortable doing that, just from the visual perspective of it.
From the banking side, we would prefer independence. So what we look at the entire scope of who's going to be involved, who's been running the company, what kind of culture is involved in it, and we want to make sure that culture continues, and we want to have independence. And so having a trustee that is looking at it in their own set of eyes is helpful for us.
And from his, I was gonna say, from his buddy's perspective, they probably don't realize that they're potentially on the hook on a personal basis for every dollar that got paid,
Yeah,
and
and-
then some.
He is. And so he's always complaining to me about, what am I getting into here? And so, but it is not unheard of, again, for an owner to say, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, I've been able to, we're going to call it, sort of influence people to not do that by talking to the CPA. I mean, because the interesting part is it's not the conversation with the selling shareholder that actually has influence, because the selling shareholder sees less fees and easier path. The person that's liable, as Tracy mentions, the CPA. And having that conversation with, do you know what an ESOP is? It's an employee stock option plan. Well, we're going to start there. You're wrong. It's an employee stock ownership plan. And so, I mean, you get to that point with the very beginning statement that they make is incorrect, and explaining the risk that they're undertaking for functionally no compensation. that we've been able to dissuade a lot of individuals from that. The other thing, and there are, bad facts make bad law, right? And we always say that so often. And the reality of it is the bad case law inside the ESOP space are scenarios that you just described. And so it's not very challenging to find a case or two that turned out poorly on those exact facts and hand it to an individual and say, this sounds an awful lot like what you're doing.
We would not want to advise on a formation without an independent trustee. We like our clients too well, and we just don't think it's right for them, and we'd rather walk than have that. And we've never had a client even seriously consider it, because when it's well informed by really good counsel and talking to really good trustees, they come to understand this is in their interests, and it's not, I buy life insurance. I'm not planning to die, but I still buy the life insurance. It's similar. It's goofy not to. We wouldn't want to be involved if they were, because we don't think we'd be fulfilling our duty to our clients if we allowed them to.
And can you explain the concept of the fiduciary responsibilities of the trustee and how that relates to why someone who's not in your hand?
Essentially, anyone who acts as a fiduciary is held to a prudent expert standard, so they're expected to know everything. Anyone who's internal, anyone who's doing it on a one-off basis, they're expected to have the same amount of knowledge about ESOPs and about being a trustee that I have, or that some of my committee members have, which means all we do is do ESOP transactions. And I will tell you, we learn things all the time or learn of new things that can be going on, but we've always got our ears to the ground. And so you're held to that standard as an individual. And that's a pretty high bar to try and cross.
All right, let's switch gears here to valuation, but I see we have one more question.
As an institutional trustee with trustee powers, I'd assume you have insurance or bonded in some way. Can you kind of speak to that? And I would imagine, to your point, Jeffrey, the CPA wouldn't, or their malpractice insurance wouldn't cover serving as trustee on an ESOP.
We have insurance. We have national trust powers. We have $20 million of insurance, plus because we're a bank, we have over $300 million in capital to back us up as well.
But I think you speak to an interesting point, and here's the challenge. Tracy touched on this a little bit. Realize we have this sort of odd intersection of trust law and ERISA, right? ERISA being a governing body that's designed, ERISA has been explained as every ridiculous idea since Adam, right? And so you're basically, it's this outgrowth of the Studebaker case to try to protect participants' money in case the company goes bankrupt. It's to try to make sure there's money set aside from the company separate to be able to pay for retirement. And so we have this standard that says, hey, you company have a retirement plan, you've got to put those assets in a trust, separate from the company. But oddly enough, there's not a federal trust. It's a state law trust. And so our number one place we lean on with respect to this is not only just clearly state law, but it's family trust law. And so often whenever you're talking about family trust law, the trustee of a family trust, a lot of times either a bank that's doing it or just a family member. And so it's really easy to figure out how to fit within the trustee position inside of a state law that's really built for family trust, to all of a sudden then have this entire interlay and overlay of this ERISA standard on that trustee. And so the challenge ends up becoming this exact space that we have insurance products, we have different positions, and we'll have CPAs that all the time sit as a trustee with respect to family trust for which they do work. Completely different world whenever they're standing as the trustee. And honestly, it starts with them standing as the trustee of the 401k plan for a client. And then they become the trustee with respect to an ESOP. And so it's a completely different overlay because you have ERISA overlaying it. But then you get the oddity of state law inside of that, which even ends up in the place that a lot of the insurance world doesn't even understand how to deal with. And so, I mean, I think it's important to realize that you get a CPA that says, well, yeah, I'm insured. I'm a trustee for 35 different trusts. There's an exclusion in there for qualified retirement plans. And so all of a sudden, the insurance that the CPA firm has doesn't actually apply to what they think that it otherwise applied to.
All right, let's switch over to the valuation firm perspective. Nick, how does your firm approach value when it's being asked to value a company?
I think Mike explained earlier that there's three broad approaches to value, looking at the income generation of the company, the income approach, a market approach where we go and we compare a company to either public markets or transactions, and an asset approach, where we take a look at the assets of the company. And I think he also explained that for most companies, if they're not heavily asset-based, So a steel mill, a construction company that owns a lot of its equipment. Those you might have an asset approach. A lot of service companies, it's not about the assets. It's about the cash flow that the company can generate. And so we would take a look at those cash flows. And really what's important here is what are the cash flows expected to be going forward? We will take a look at what the company's done in the past because the past actually happened. Hopefully the future is better than the past, but we're gonna take a look at projected performance and say, does this make sense compared to where the company's been, compared to where the industry's going, compared to the overall market? Do the underlying assumptions make sense? And has the company made budgets and projections in the past? Are they good at projecting? Some companies are good, some companies are not good at it. And we'll get into those details and take a look at those cash flows and discount them back to their current value using a discount rate. Which again, as Mike explained, was based on the weighted average cost of capital. A couple of things, when we take a look at cash flows, I keep saying cash flows, we're taking a look at earnings, but we're also taking a look at the need for the company to take some of their earnings and reinvest it back in the company. So a company that doesn't need a lot of working capital or a lot of fixed assets, a lot more of their profits available for cash flow. That enhances value compared to a company that has a heavy need to reinvest in their company. That's one way of looking at value. A lot of times you'll hear people say, well, wait a minute, a company should sell for 5 times EBITDA. Well, what is that? That's a shorthand for more of a market approach, where we'll go out and we'll take a look at companies in the market, both publicly traded companies and transactions involving companies, and say, well, what do these companies sell at based on their multiples of sales, EBITDA, EBIT, or whatever other metrics seem to make sense. We like to look at these things from multiple methods because hopefully the methods give us similar values. A lot of times they don't, and we try to ask ourselves, well, why? Is it because the company is projecting very strong growth beyond what the market is seeing? And if we believe that growth is reasonable, maybe the market approach isn't going to give us a full indication of value. On the other hand, we may say, no, we're projecting about the same amount of growth as the market. So what are the other factors that go into play there, and allows us to really dig into what are the factors going to drive value both now and support the value going forward in the future.
Nick, you brought up multiples. What are the current multiples in certain industries where we see a lot of ESOPs, such as consulting that we've spoken about, distribution, manufacturing, construction? If you can give us some examples.
Sure. So when we talk about, again, people will talk about EBITDA multiples. This is a shorthand way of thinking about value, just to kind of get you where you are in the ballpark. What tends to differentiate one company's multiple versus another is their industry, their size, and then specifics to the company. So we will tend to see in general, for example, that companies that maybe have EBITDA in the $1 to $10 million range maybe trade in the 5 to 6 times multiple, all other things being equal. Whereas if you step up and you've got EBITDA of greater than 10 million, you might get a whole extra turn on that. Maybe we're talking about 7 times EBITDA, 6 to 7 times EBITDA. Less than $1 million in EBITDA, that's another break point that we see. It also varies on industries, although I've got to tell you, I think the specifics of the companies probably overshadow that in most cases. So the multiples I just laid out are pretty typical. There are a few exceptions. Construction companies tend to trade for lower multiples. So if you think about an engineering company, that's going to depend. Some engineering companies are really construction companies, and other engineering companies are very much professional service companies, and so you want to take a look at the actual dynamics of that company. One industry that tends to trade greater than those multiples are IT. IT and software companies tend to trade at higher multiples. So you may see, instead of trading at, if instead of 6 times, maybe they're trading it at 8 times.
Why is that? Why are ITs?
Well, I think it comes down to a couple of things, and one of them are, and I talked about the specifics, I think one of them is growth. I think a lot of people look at IT companies and say, by their very nature, we think they have a lot of growth opportunity, whereas a construction company is going to move, ebb and flow with the economy, has a lot of cyclical risk, and And boy, I've seen construction companies where a couple of bad projects in 1 year can really tank it. So a lot of these multiples that you see for industries, no one's really paying more for an industry just because you're in an industry. They're paying more because they think there's greater growth opportunities or a lower risk level associated with that industry.
Nick,
There's someone in the back.
Particular industries that are not particularly well suited for ESOPs?
I would say that an industry where you're going to have a high level of employee turnover. We did some work with a large restaurant that who had a lot, thousands upon thousands of employees who they had high turnover, so a lot of them never got vested in the ESOP. There were a lot of other complexities, and it just made it tough for them to effectively have a successful ESOP over time. It wasn't a disaster, don't get me wrong, but that industry, that particular company, just given their employee base, it did not make a good fit. I would also point out that very small companies, again, the cost and complexity of an ESOP can really overshadow some of the other benefits of having an ESOP.
The two areas I think we see, I won't say it's industries, but two things we run across that we have to address. They're not problems, we just have to make sure we address. The first is bonding. If you have an industry or an entity that has a bonding concern, we need to make sure that the bank and the bonding agencies are in line and in step and understand what's going forward. The second place we've run across the problems is any licensure, any entity that requires a licensure with respect to the operation of the company. We run across this with architects. We've gotten past it, but the reality of it is a lot of states require an architect to be an owner that actually signs a drawing. And so you have to find a solution around that. Oddly enough, we have a decent number of architects that what they do is the architects themselves are the trustees, and then they hire an independent fiduciary to direct them as the directed trustee.
You and I had a case like that, and it worked while the company was operating in Ohio. Ohio was a little bit more lenient, but once they started opening up offices in other states, they could see that was going to be a real problem.
But we've gotten past that, to the extent that we now have ESOPs inside of the medical industry. And so, it's just a planning reality. It's not an inhibitor to keeping from doing an ESOP. It's just a planning reality that needs to be sort of at the forefront of the transaction.
And I find in general, anything that's state licensed can have weird requirements depending on the state. We ran into some problems with an insurance company based in Florida. I've been fingerprinted more times than I care to count for some of my clients because they actually require that a human being obviously be fingerprinted. So the police office knows me well for only that reason.
Yeah.
Point that out. I swear.
From a bank standpoint, we're really looking at sustained cash flow. And we'll look at the historical stuff, what the projections look like, and we need to get very comfortable that we understand where the valleys might be at. And if there is more risk involved that we think, then we may shorten up, potentially the term of the ESOP or the first bite. Instead of 5 years, it may be 3 years, knowing that we're probably going to get out of that in a year and a half or something like that. And we may shrink the airball loan that we'll do. Instead of 2 times, it may be closer to 1. And so we try to take what we see as a perceived risk in the industry too and balance that out.
We've also run into some problems where you have a very large asset that throws off very little cash flow. Marinas being an example. Had one of those that we had to unwind. The property itself was worth about $15 million. I'm going to point out that we didn't put this one in place. We just helped unwind it. And the marina itself was only throwing off about $200,000 of income. And so that they could not support any payoffs, any payouts of the participants. They had balances that were millions of dollars and they could not afford it. It's a bad situation.
Tracy, that brings me to my next question. Nick, what are the key components that either challenge or increase value when you're doing evaluation? And I know we touched on things like recurring revenue, customer concentration, growth rates. If you could address that.
Yeah, well, one of them is customer concentration, as a potential risk. Again, I think earlier, it was it Mike? Were you the one talking? Yeah, you've got to evaluate just what are the risks associated with it, and there can be mitigants to the risk, but having that one customer is still going to be a risk. You're probably going to get a lower value on a company with high customer concentration than one that has a diverse base. You know, we've seen companies that, again, having high levels of reinvestment needs in capital expenditures and working capital, it turns out that if you have to reinvest more back into the company for every dollar of sales than you're getting in profit, it's going to be really hard to, it's not the company has no value, it's going to be really hard to enhance that value. So we see companies who can enhance their value by improving their working capital management. You know, manage their inventory better. I saw one company saw a nice pop in value because they got an accounts receivable person in there, and all of a sudden, accounts receivable turned into cash, and going forward, their needs were a lot less, and there was just that much more free cash flow, and the balance sheet looked better.
Yes.
Can you finish that story from Horizon about the $15 million asset that couldn't pay participants off? Why couldn't the asset have been sold?
The asset we ended up having to unwind it because there was so much debt on the asset itself. It was actually,
So there wasn't 15 million.
there was not 15 million of equity. They couldn't make their loan payments on the debt.
Regarding having different entities tied together, you might have like the operating company, which is associated with the real estate company, and they're both owned by the same person, but there's different tax IDs, et cetera, and they're kind of interwoven. Do you recommend, or do you require those being split, or do you say that it's all one package, or how does that work?
Doing a deal with any real estate ends up lengthening and expensing and making the transaction more expensive. We've done them. Most often, 90% of the time, if not higher, we split off the real estate. The challenge whenever you split off the real estate is realize you're leasing from the selling shareholder, is the entity that the selling shareholder owns is leasing a piece of property from themselves functionally, and so that has to be at fair market value. So we'll end up needing to get a broker's opinion that lease is at fair market value, and a lot of times trustees, when I'm representing trustees, will ask for that lease to be memorialized on a longer term. So it's at fair market value, and it's a 5-year term. So when Nick does his projection, does his analysis, it's built into the system of understanding how much, how long. That being said, I've done deals that we've bought real estate as well. And the benefit of buying real estate is you no longer have to pay your rent, and you own that asset. And that asset's a benefit because once the loans, first of all, it increases the cost of the transaction. You're selling more. Second, it's a hard asset to which to offer to be able to provide a loan against. And so the bankers are happy because there's a hard asset there. It does slow down a transaction because you're doing a loan with respect to a piece of real estate, and that's a little bit longer process.
You're adding debt to the balance sheet in most cases.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that you're adding debt to the extent of the transaction anyway. And so any hard assets help because you clear out the airball position. So,
From the banking standpoint, we'll do it either way. It doesn't really matter. We're going to lever it up, 80% loan to value, and we can, a lot of times, if it's in the ESOP transaction, then we can take that part and lengthen the term on that part of it because we've got a fixed asset to support it. So it can work both ways.
All right, for,
Got one in the back.
oh, I'm sorry, here we go.
You made a comment earlier about the burden on a small company. What is the approximate run rate for all of the setup fees, fiduciary, audit, tax, legal, and then ongoing? Is it a percent of sales? Is it a set minimum price? I'm just trying to, because don't you have to also factor that in, obviously, along with the debt repayment when you're looking at your 5-year cash flow model, but you're going to have to be able to support all of that new infrastructure.
yeah, I mean, and I may actually let the investment bankers speak to price a little bit. We colloquially say it's 2 to 3% of the value of a company until you get to a company that's a substantial size. The ongoing position is really a little bit easier than the transaction. You have a trustee that's an ongoing transaction. Their fee is usually less than what it is for a transaction on an annual basis. You have a valuation firm, has to do an annual valuation. Their valuation is less because they're not writing a fairness opinion for each year. They're just writing a valuation opinion and helping the trustee. You have a record keeper who wasn't a part of the transaction in the first place. It's like your 401k record keeper in reality. They're the people that keep the balances. And you're going to have counsel. You need competent counsel to be able to handle the plan document. That being said, a lot of times with respect to my work with respect to a client immediately following a transaction falls off significantly, and I don't get clients to call me back until about 1 year, 2 years later once they've figured out what they're doing. And so they sort of go back to their space of, okay, I sold to an ESOP, I'm going to go run my company now. And in about 12, 15 months later, they show back up and go, okay, we've taken a breath, what do we do now? And so you'll end up seeing that council costs they're not exorbitant by any stretch, but they're $10,000-$15,000 a year on top of just to keep everything sort of going forward. And so
Baked into your feasibility analysis up front, I would think, for your client, right? To see whether or not this is gonna make sense for them longer term. Back to your marina example. Had someone done that full baked out analysis based on their cash flow, they would have had a better idea of that, and they probably wouldn't have even, you know what I mean, gone down the path if they would have understood that they couldn't support that from a cash flow, you know what I mean, ongoing.
Well, let me just say this, the ongoing expenses aren't that material to keep an ESOP up and going. The formation expenses is material. But once they're up and running, it's not a huge sum of money, and when contrasted with the taxes not being paid, because you got a state and federal tax-free entity, yes, you have to put a quarter in the jukebox to hear the music, it costs a quarter, but then you get the music. Here, the cost of the professionals to maintain the ESOP, they're not pennies, but compared to the tax savings and materials, in any kind of material transaction, they're really de minimis.
So, and in Tracy,
They do exist, and it's not the feasibility analysis up front, because that's about what we sell for, but we always, can procure quotes from the professional community so that they can so that the company understands, oh, I have $35,000 or $40,000 a year of ongoing costs I used to have, and that can be a number, and it's out there. But then you look at, companies are saving $2.5 million taxes, well, not a bad return.
So, but Tracy's example, I think this is important. The company didn't have trouble because the professional fees on an ongoing basis. The company, the company had trouble really paying the participants off.
It was the debt and the participants. They couldn't fund either one of those with the way they were structured.
I mean, and so realize you have to generate enough cash flow to be able to pay participants off. You can't take a stock certificate to Kroger and buy groceries. And so if I own 2% of the company turns that back into cash, so I can go to Kroger to buy groceries. And so the reality is that if you have an asset, a hard asset like a marina, that's worth $15 million, that's not throwing off enough cash to be able to turn participants' stock certificate into cash, it doesn't work as a function. And that's a feasibility point. The ongoing professional fees are really minuscule and not a concern on a feasibility basis.
But to your point, we would have, in the feasibility analysis, said this probably doesn't make sense because you got a huge asset, no cash flow, it's not gonna work as it is.
Before they go down the road halfway and realize, oh shoot, I should.
And we do that, all the time. If we don't think it's a good ESOP, we tell people, we say, look, we don't want to be involved in that ESOP, you shouldn't do it. And then people wait until they fix whatever the issues are, and then they come back to us and say, okay, how about now? And sometimes then they are.
Non-productive real estate's never going to be a good ESOP, though.
Right.
Yeah.
But Ted, you had mentioned earlier that you try to model them out so they're covering it 2 times.
Yeah.
So something fundamentally had to happen, or it wasn't structured right to start with.
Yeah, that would have been at .00 2 times. So we would have, come back when it's 2 times,
All right, let's pivot to the legal perspective.
I haven't talked enough yet.
Well, we want to, want everybody to have their chance here. David, what is the role of the company counsel and the trustees counsel in an ESOP transaction?
Yeah, and we haven't spent a whole lot of time today discussing, but in reality, an ESOP transaction, it's a negotiated transaction. And really, what you're doing is you're trying to get to a place that the value paid with respect to the transaction looks an awful lot like what an arm's length transaction between a willing buyer and a willing seller would be. And so to the extent that you're trying to get to that space of having a transaction between a willing buyer and a willing seller, it means that the company has counsel. And the company's driving the transaction with respect to the counsel, helping the company and selling shareholder adopt the ESOP and put forth the first offer to the trustee that was appointed to say, hey, we'll sell you the company for $50 million. The trustee then has to have its own team. And so they have a valuation expert and they have their own counsel to be able to evaluate the terms of the letter of intent that was given from the company to the trustee, and then to be able to represent the position of the participants in the ESOP, the trustee, with respect to the transaction. And so you end up having 2 parties on either side, like you would in any arm's length transaction, to be able to negotiate the terms of the transaction. The benefit that we have, and this was noted before, is that it is a small community, and there's not a whole lot of bravado inside of the community, which is fantastic. And so there's not a great deal of grandstanding with respect to the, I'm going to fight for exposition for the point of getting exposition. And so we end up really getting to terms on a transaction pretty quickly. There aren't that many moving pieces. And so when it gets down to the moving pieces, it's what kind of executive compensation are we going to have? What's our price? What are the interest rates we're going to pay for the transaction? And then in reality, what do our indemnifications look like? And so whenever we deal with that, you're basically negotiating 4, 5, 6 pieces. And whenever you negotiate the 4, 5, 6 pieces from each side, it really accelerates the process as compared to a full sale negotiation for a sale. Now, that being said, I'm working on a sell side of an ESOP transaction right now where I'm representing a trustee. The company has counsel and we're selling the company. They've shopped the company for 4 months. We're going to do the transaction negotiation in about 8 days. So we do deals whenever, in the non-ESOP, that happens to be an ESOP sell-off, but that's the M&A space. We'll do that a lot inside of the M&A space, that it's really quick, and there's not a ton of fighting because you've really winnowed down your places that you're going to argue. It's a lot the same whenever we get to that space, and I'll let Tracy sort of speak to how you lean on company counsel, as on trustee counsel, as opposed to in standing against company counsel.
Standing against.
Well, I know, sort of negotiating with.
Oh, okay. Well, so it is truly, I was going to say, one of the important things when we hire counsel is, as trustee, we are the buyer. We are truly acting as the buyer. We rely on them to tell us if there's anything from a legal perspective that they have concerns with as it pertains to the letter of intent. Same with the valuator. We rely on them to tell us from a financial perspective. Having said that, we've reviewed all of it ourselves, and then from a holistic perspective, that's what we do. We're looking at it from a holistic perspective. I know we have a committee internally, and I know what our committee will typically accept and what they won't accept, and what we've seen in other deals. And in addition to that, one of the benefits we have is we know kind of where the community, what has been deemed, what's acceptable, what other people are seeing, what's going on in the M&A market overall by talking to counsel, by talking to the valuator, talking to other professionals, being involved in other deals. So it can be pretty involved and you can be pulling from a lot of different sources. I think that was your question.
Yeah.
I think.
Dave, go ahead, please.
Ever insisted on the sellers having separate counsel?
On the sellers as opposed to the company? Yeah, I have at times. We'll get to places that sellers have separate counsel. The first place we always end up seeing that is if you're going to negotiate an employment agreement. If trustee requires an employment agreement to be negotiated for a key executive to stay on, we'll ask that we'll recommend that the seller at that point have counsel with respect to the negotiation of that employment agreement. About a 50% take-up rate at that point. Sellers at some point say, I'll do that to myself. Other sellers will get counsel. As company counsel at that point, I won't negotiate that employment agreement. I'll be a scrivener for that employment agreement. We'll put a form in front of you and sort of say this generally works, but in reality, whenever that employment agreement happens, I'm really representing nobody or the company with respect to it, but it's really a request of the trustee to be able to get that in place. Other times on very large transactions, we've seen seller counsel and specific seller counsel with respect to seller issues that are arising. Those tend to be not single family owned companies. They tend to be whenever you have multi-party owned companies where there are 3, 4, 5 different families inside of a company and you're selling to an ESOP, they will end up getting their own counsel to represent their interest in connection with the transaction. Company counsel still is the quarterback, still really runs the transaction, will make the offer, but you play a little bit more of traffic cop as company counsel at that point, trying to facilitate a transaction between selling shareholders and the trustee.
I would say we more commonly see out them having counsel if they're no longer actively involved in the company and not actively involved with legal counsel as well. And I don't think we've had we've bought from an estate several times, and I can't think of a single time when it wasn't an estate that they haven't had outside counsel.
Yeah.
David, can you speak to the special counsel role that you sometimes play in transactions and how you work with the regular counsel, the trusted advisor of the firm, if they are not interested in doing the ESOP?
Yeah, and I'll say that, and I sort of speak to this a little bit. Like I mentioned before, I'm an employee benefits attorney by trade, and so a lot of times we'll come into transactions where there is a company, a good, well-respected company that's with a law firm that's good and well-respected. They just don't have. They maybe even have employee benefits counsel. They don't have ESOP-specific counsel in their firm. And the firm's afraid of making a mistake with respect to the transaction. And so we'll come in and be engaged specifically for the purpose of representing the company in connection with the transaction and with respect to the ESOP. Our goal there is not to supplant the company counsel. Our goal is to actually work with the company counsel to accomplish the transaction and be able to facilitate the transaction. We tend to, I don't mind that relationship. I know some of my contemporaries actually have a little bit of a problem with the relationship. I think it works really well. And the reason why I think it works really well is, unfortunately, Tracy mentioned this, there's a whole lot of ESOP law that's unwritten. There's a lot that we get from just the ability to continuously go to conferences, listen what's happening, listen to the Department of Labor, having good continuous conversations with the Department of Labor and the IRS and Treasury. I'll give an example of this. I'm actually I'm the chair of this is the longest title in the history of the world. I am the chair of the ESOP subcommittee of the employee benefits section of the committee of the tax section of the American Bar Association. Imagine 120 of the biggest tax nerds there are. We gather 3 times a year. We're gathering on Thursday in Boston. About 10 of us do ESOP work. And so the group of us get together on the ESOP specific committee. As a part of that, I chair the committee that basically heads up the ABA's positions with respect to ESOPs. We have great conversations and contacts between the Department of Labor, to Treasury, and to the IRS. This morning, I was on the phone with Associate Chief Counsel to Treasury, asking some questions about ESOP documentation, and they're coming out with regs about trying to figure out how we get our documents through the system now. And so it's those conversations that you have and the place in which you bring into that table that an individual that maybe has an employee benefits group but doesn't have ESOP specific group can't really do a transaction as efficiently or as easily as possible. So when we come into that role, we're not trying to supplant company counsel. We're trying to do a deal as easily as possible. And we'll help after the transaction with respect to the company, sort of moving the company forward to this place where they're 100% owned by the ESOP. But the reality of it is that we often will come in as special counsel with respect to a limited engagement for that transaction, and then following the transaction with respect to the maintenance of the retirement plan itself. And so it is something we do. We do it quite often. I would much rather do deals that way than see deals done poorly by firms that don't have specific ESOP counsel. Because the challenge with respect to that is you have firms that have not specific ESOP counsel. The client's upset because the bills that you're going to end up overcharging, because it turns out that the firm didn't have the expertise. The transaction doesn't run anywhere near as smooth, and so people like Tracy, whenever you walk into the deal, aren't as happy. You end up with the potential for mistakes because you have counsel that hasn't been doing this a lot or enough to be able to understand where those spaces, the unwritten spaces in law exist. And any time we have one of those deals out there, it runs the risk of being a negative story for the community generally. And we hate negative stories for the community generally. And so I really do like to have people inside of the community, and hopefully we make the community more inclusive, but to have people inside of the community work on transactions and make sure we can shepherd the transactions through those pieces and those spaces of law that aren't necessarily in a reg yet.
And I could probably, since he's only seen kind of that side of it, I can speak to the other side. I had a situation where they chose to use their corporate counsel because it was a pretty small transaction, and I could understand. Corporate counsel didn't actually realize that they could comment on the ESOP documents until the week before closing. And it almost blew up the entire transaction. And I actually had to calm down our attorney because he was very angry that suddenly everything we had agreed upon, it was changing at the last minute once he realized he could actually comment. And I've never had a situation that I've seen where the counsel, the ESOP counsel that's brought in to kind of help through that transition has actually taken the client away on an ongoing basis. And we work with a lot of different clients, so I've never actually seen that before.
And to that point, that's why in the financing side of it, it's real important to have a good quarterback like Lazier, because they make sure that they've got the right folks that are going to go back and forth and make it a smooth transaction.
Tom, we're going to switch over to the bank's perspective. I see we have one more question here.
One more question for David. David, do most companies who are anticipating an ESOP transaction, do they maintain another type of retirement plan?
Yeah.
401k or profit sharing or something, so you have another source of retirement for the.
Yeah, there's two sort of spaces I think you need to hit with respect to that. I think it's important. Almost every client of ours that whenever we come in is maintaining another retirement plan. The most common we end up seeing is just a safe harbor 401k plan. So it's 100% of the first 3% and 50% of the next 2%. About 80-85% of our clients, I'd say, keep that safe harbor 401k around as a safe harbor 401k. Now, here's the problem with it, right? you have we call it a 415 limit. You're basically going to be limited to 25% of compensation of employees in contributions to retirement plans. If I'm sending 5% of compensation, and it ends up not being fully 5 because it's a match, but if I'm sending 5% of compensation to the 401k plan, I made that 25% 20. And so that needs to be factored into my feasibility analysis to understand how much money do I have to be able to repay my, going into the ESOP to repay my loan coming back out. The secondary space we see is a good number of plans that also companies will have profit sharing plans on top of that safe harbor 401k. Almost all of our companies at that point get rid of the profit sharing plan. The theory being we're now really converting that profit sharing money into the ESOP contribution. You participant will actually take the benefit of the ESOP contribution. But again, it's a planning question because you're trying to figure out how much money you can flow through the ESOP and back out. We recommend, even if there are no employer contributions, that 100% of our clients that have ESOPs have 401ks, so participants have the opportunity to self-defer. We're actually seeing now a good number of states that if you're under a certain size and don't offer a retirement plan, a qualified retirement plan, you're going to have to start offering one. Mm-hmm. California has a law pending actually to cause that. So we're going to end up seeing that basically every company is going to end up with some form of contributory plan in the first place, and we think it's a good diversification mechanism regardless. But I like to point out, this is the thing. Right? So of my clients, rich benefits are a safe harbor match of 100% of the first 3% and 50% of the next 2. So that's 4%. And maybe a 4% profit sharing contribution. That's 8% of compensation, right? We're talking about putting a retirement plan in that's going to give a participant 25 and sometimes more than 25% of their compensation as a contribution. That's a pretty good delta. And since, you have a set, what is it? I have a finance degree from the University of Dayton. That's a 17% delta. I haven't used it in 16 years. I used it a little bit in law school. I had to pay for law school somehow. So you have a 17% delta there, right? And so whenever you're dealing with that big of a delta, that's really gravy. And so the challenge becomes is that, should I provide some other benefit for my employees? I should. That's really the K and the K match. And so it ends up letting people diversify. Everything else on top of which is really a retirement contribution they wouldn't have gotten in any other setting. And so therefore it is a great benefit because it's a retirement benefit they wouldn't have gotten in any other setting.
All right, well, speaking of finance, we're going to turn it over to Tom and the bank's perspective. And we're going to 4:15, but if people have other questions, we will be here. We have a cocktail hour. We're happy to continue, on the dialogue. We just want to cover all of our topics here today. Tom, why do your customers like ESOPs?
Well, there's several reasons why they like it, but part of it is the continuity of the business not leaving and not being sold to a third party. A lot of times the sellers, the owners, want to have that stay. They like it because it involves and can incent the employees. It's a good thing to keep them involved in the company. They can see the benefits of that. They like it because of the tax-deferred or tax-free nature of it. We try to look at it from a sustainable cash flow standpoint and understand it and understand the company and then move through the process. But I think after the seller notes are paid off, I think the real power of the ESOPs remain that the tax-free status that really that company has allows them power to continue to have strong working capital positions and buy additional businesses down the road, and it gives them so much flexibility after the seller notes are paid out.
Now, as a lender, do you look at ESOPs in a different manner than other companies?
Yes, we do. And again, from a cash flow standpoint, the tax-free nature gives a lot more flexibility in the amount that we can really finance. For us to do airball lending is sometimes a challenge, but when we see a sustainable cash flow model and understand the company, the employees, the whole process, we get comfortable with an airball number, which is different from a lot of banks. So the size of that airball is going to depend on a lot of different factors, but we do look at them differently.
What kind of collateral is used to secure an ESOP transaction?
Well, typically we'll have a first lien on the business assets, but again, depending on the type of business it is, If it's an IT type company, there's not a lot of assets there, intellectual property and some receivable base. So it's typically, most of that loan is an airball unsecured loan. We will do a line of credit and match that up with the receivables for a separate piece, but in most instances, it's going to be an unsecured deal. Again, what we do is get comfortable with the sustainability of that cash flow and then model a repayment term that makes us comfortable and is also beneficial for the client. If it's a heavy asset-based, then we'll get appraisals on whether it's equipment, real estate, whatever it is. We may grant longer terms on that stuff to avoid some of the reappraisal issues that we've got. And then we'll just reload on part of the airball that's going to spin a little quicker.
Regarding that, you said that you'd be willing to offer, say, line of credit loans. Would that also apply to CapEx, installment notes, and treasury management type functions?
Yes.
So basically, all banking functions would transfer over to you from the old company?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and we would want to understand what that CapEx is up front. That's all part of the process too. Right.
We talked a little bit about the issue of personal guarantees. What is your bank's philosophy on that in an ESOP transaction?
Well, what's unusual, typically, if we're doing lending on the C&I side or whatever, you're going to have some type of a guarantee involved in it, a limited guarantee at minimum. On an ESOP loan, you're not going to have a guarantee. We've not done one with a guarantee. They're not owning the company outright. Again, what we try to do is get comfortable with the sustainable cash flow and understand that our airball loan really is 18 to 24 months at the most, and understanding that if we've got confidence in those projections and the sustainable business, that we're going to get out of that first bite pretty quickly. And so then we reload and understand it again, but typically you're not going to see guarantees on an ESOP loan.
Any questions for our group? We have a few minutes left before we break. This can be for any of our panel members on any topic. I want to make sure that we cover all of our questions. Yes, Mike?
Yeah, Sherry, we seem to have focused on the transaction in general, what happened shortly thereafter. But what about the longer-term impacts that you all have seen on the employees who participated in this stuff? You know, 1 year later, 5 years later, 20 years later, what do you notice about that? How does it impact behavior? How does it impact the company?
I have a client, I represent the trustee of a client that's out of Norfolk, Virginia. And I go to about 2 board meetings a year for them. Pretty active company, they're pretty acquisitions. The chairman of their board, every board meeting, opens up the ledger and pulls a couple random individuals' account statements out. Now, remind you, this is a call center. So these are individuals that are they just raised their minimum wage to $11 an hour across the country. And so they're individuals that are making $11 an hour. And he'll pull random account statements out of individuals that are $600,000, $700,000. And so you're talking about individuals who functionally are working in jobs that are paying a little bit more than fast food industry. And so they're paying management level at fast food. I will admit I stopped at a McDonald's on the way here. And there was a sign up for $10.50 an hour for middle level managers. So you're functionally the same place. Individuals having $600,000 and $700,000 account balances. And so, I mean, that changes their aspect. And we always say, I'm a tax nerd, one. I'm an employee benefits attorney by trade. And you have to realize that when you go back and understand ERISA, what it really was built on, the entirety of the retirement system was supposed to be a 3-legged stool. The 3-legged stool was built on Social Security, employer-provided pensions, defined benefit plans from employers because you were going to stay with the same company for 35 years and they were going to give you a paycheck until you died, and your self-savings. The first one of those that went away really easy was the self-savings. We're not necessarily, as Americans, very great at putting away our own money to be able to accomplish that. We've tried toys, we've tried tricks, right? But the self-savings kind of disappeared. Pensions are gone. Even the government level, pensions are going away. And so you have states and the federal government are hiring new employees without pensions. And so sadly, we're kind of left with a stool with one stake, in it being Social Security. And the intriguing, the neat aspect of this is whenever you talk to this client, you talk the stories about this client, they end up putting that second leg down. And yeah, it's a defined contribution plan, but it's not really self-savings. It's company savings. And that company savings is rebuilding that position that the defined benefit plan stood on. And if you have that individual add $1 an hour and some match to their savings pot, then they really do again get to a three-legged stool. And so one of the things that I really enjoy about it is that aspect of going to that meeting and hearing the stories of the $11, $11.5, $12 an hour employees talk about, see that event. I go to their Christmas party every year. It's a fantastic story, and you'll be able to see individuals that have these great opportunities that they've never been able to have. But basically, it's an opportunity to be able to turn the tax code in a way to reaccomplish the defined benefit plan in a space where it wasn't otherwise there. Because it's not necessarily the DB, it's actually the employer-provided forced savings.
How long did you say that plan's been?
God, when did they do that? In 2003 is when the plan, they put it in place.
Is there a vesting period for the employees?
Yeah, you can do a 6-year graded vesting schedule or a 3-year cliff. Most of our clients end up utilizing a 3-year cliff because it's really challenging to split shares out on a graded vesting schedule. But it's a choice of the company with respect to what they choose. And I'm probably wrong, and Pete's going to tell me I'm wrong, that the majority use graded, but okay.
I see another question
I'm
here.
curious about this as a recruiting and retention tool. Somebody I think spoke to millennials wanting a piece of it earlier. The panel's experience with this as a recruiting and retention tool. And what does that do as far as the evaluation goes if your makeup is more millennial heavy or not millennial heavy? As far as does that even impact your evaluation? And then sorry for asking a two-part question. But then what is the impact on recruiting and retention when you do something like this?
Well, I mean, I think some of it is what Dave just described was walking the walk. I mean, an awful lot of people will say we have an ESOP and we do this, but if they don't back it up, and I'm not just talking about finance, I'm talking about communication, and so that your people really feel like they are participating. They're not running the company as owners, but there's a little bit more open communication. There's a cultural piece that goes with it, which I think dovetails really nice with what the millennials kind of want. I'm not a millennial myself, but I have 3 at home, and actually I got rid of them all, so that's okay.
What's the going rate for millennial right now?
Wow, yeah. Well, with millennials, millennials are more expensive than they were 3 years ago. I will tell you that much. But I think if you adopt the kind of cultural things that help people understand that we have an employee, stock ownership plan here, and that people believe it's real and not that's just something management's saying to save taxes. If they really see that it's real, and you get some people who actually do get their checks as they retire, that culture then it does help. It creates the kind of culture that actually I think is very attractive to millennials versus all the gray hairs in the corner office have all of the ownership. So I think culturally it really does help. From a valuation perspective, I don't really typically see the backup. I was going to say I don't really see that makeup of millennials versus Gen Xers, whatever, impacting the value. Although, and we're not going to get into this today, understand that the way an ESOP ultimately puts money in the participant's pocket is when they retire, or that's ideally, which means there's a check that has to be written. There's a repurchase obligation somewhere down the road, and your mix of people will impact that. That's not something that is a big deal day one when you're putting an ESOP in place. But ultimately, you got to be able to afford to actually cash people out somewhere down the road.
And that's where we've seen the impact on value when you have an older group and you see a lot of your future cash flow going out to buy them out.
Because that will feed back onto value.
It's always interesting to me. I can always tell when a company's really adopted it when you see little things that they're doing. When you walk in a shop, I'll see people will have little name tags that say owner, or when they're at a convention, someone will say, well, I want to talk to the owner, and they go, hey, you're talking to him. And then they'll address whatever the concern is. That adds immediate, respectability to that individual. Or we actually had a very funny story where the day after closing, the owner had a specific reserved spot at the business. And the day after closing, an employee parked in that spot.
That's well played.
That was
That's just well played. Yeah, that's
They
just, yeah.
they truly bought into that ownership culture on the very first day. Needless to say, that spot was changed to say CEO. But nonetheless, they got a week ride before they could get that taken care of.
I see Judy here welcoming us into the cocktail reception. If anyone has any additional questions, we will be circulating around, so please feel free to ask them. And I would just like to thank our esteemed panel today. I think it was a very illuminating discussion on some of the current issues we have in ESOP transactions, and we really appreciate you, especially people that travel.
Thank you.